Nazi International, Part 1, by Berk Gumus. September 18th, 2023, 710th. Contact Tuesday, the 11th of September, 2018, 2114 HHRS.
There is no problem in this respect, for our technology is such that such sightings can only take place if the Earth Foreigners or Earth Future, as well as the secretive Earth grouping with the progressive flying apparatuses in South America, have no possibility whatsoever of locating or otherwise perceiving our flying apparatuses on a technical basis.
But that you have just mentioned the earthly grouping in South America, etc., that irritates me a little, because up to now this was not allowed to be mentioned openly.
You can call it that, as you have explained it. But as far as my statement is concerned, concerning the grouping keeping itself secret, it is now no longer necessary not to mention this, to which, however, I will give you a personal explanation later, which will be only for you.
The surrender.
May 7th and 8, 1945. German armed forces under the command of Reichspräsident and Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz surrender to Allied forces unconditionally at Reims, France, and in Berlin, but no representative of the Nazi Party itself is present at either surrender ceremony. To put it succinctly, the Allies had missed the golden opportunity to insist that a representative of the Nazi Party sign an instrument of the surrender and abolition of the party. The German armed forces surrendered, and Germany surrendered, but the Nazi Party did not. The Japanese surrender is explicit and clear that the surrender is being made by and for the imperial government and all its departments, and the imperial Japanese military. And this was the doorway that permitted post-war neo-Nazism to insist that the party and its ideals, goals, projects and organization were alive and well. Indeed, if no legal surrender of the party or its favored organs and instrumentalities, the SS, for example, was ever effected, then this left their chains of command formally and in practice intact. In a certain sense, the bungled surrenders helped to feed not only the mythos, but the reality of Nazi survival and of its internationalization. To understand the Nazi post-war survival plans, it is necessary to have an understanding of that pre-war pattern. The Interessengemeinschaft Farbenindustrie, AG, better known as IG Farben, was the gargantuan German chemicals cartel that was broken up at the end of World War II into the little firms of Höchst, Bayer, BASF Bayerischen Anilin- und Sodafabrik, and AGFA Aktiengesellschaft für Anilinfabrikation, each of which was and is a large multinational corporation in its own right. The fact that the components of IG Farben are so big gives an indicator of the size and power of the enormous Farben cartel. Farben was, by anyone's reckoning, the corporation that ran Nazi Germany's enormous military-industrial complex.
The IG Farben building left in Frankfurt is now used by the Goethe University. IG Farben logo right. From Wikipedia, IG_Farben.
A large role was played by IG Farben's pre-war cartel and patent licensing contracts with foreign corporations in the United Kingdom, France, and the United States. In other words, the Farben cartel itself was created in 1926 with Wall Street financial assistance. And in that lies an important story, for it is in the outlines of those arrangements and agreements that one may also discern the form and shape that the Nazis' post-war survival plans would follow.
Farben's system of cartel and license agreements also became in the pre-war period part of a much larger pattern of international corporate cooperation between Nazi Germany and the Western powers, particularly the United States.
The goals of the international elite in funding communism and Nazism.
By putting Franklin Delano Roosevelt FDR's New Deal socialism, Adolf Hitler National Socialism, and Vladimir Lenin communist socialism into power. The international elite was running a grand long-term experiment, not only in bringing socialism of one form or another into authority in the major powers of the world, but also to determine which version of socialism was the most robust in opposing a presumed threat, but also to determine the most pliable and easily manipulated corporate elites. The long-term goal was, of course, world corporate socialism. Having put Bolshevism into power, the internationalist corporate elite soon found itself faced with a problem, namely that the Soviet Union and its Communist International was serious about expanding communist power under Soviet auspices around the world, and particularly into Central Europe and Germany. Faced with the possibility of a power bloc centered on Russia and Germany under communist control, the ability to manipulate and control that bloc, much less oppose it if the need arose, became quite problematical, if not downright impossible. In short, the balance of power, upon which the larger scheme depended, would have been threatened. Having created the communist monster, the elite then decided to finance another monster, Nazism, to oppose it. This plan was indeed realistic, since Germany was the only power conceivably in a position to oppose Russia economically and militarily. France and Great Britain simply had neither the muscle nor the geopolitical position to do it, and the United States was ill-disposed to become involved in European affairs. As a result of these considerations, the pattern of international corporate cartel and licensing arrangements between the Western powers, particularly the United States and Germany, emerged. An example of this American-German corporate cooperation is easily seen in Hitler's first Reichsbank president, Dr. Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht. The Schacht family had its origins in New York, and Hjalmar Schacht himself worked for the prominent Wall Street financial house of Equitable Trust, which was controlled by the Morgan firm. And throughout his life, Hjalmar retained these Wall Street connections. Newspapers and contemporary sources record his repeated visits with Owen Young of General Electric, Farish, chairman of Standard Oil of New Jersey, and their banking counterparts. In brief, Schacht was a member of the international financial elite. He is a key link between the Wall Street elite and Hitler's inner circle.
Dawes and Young plans.
Since World War I had left the world's gold standard all but shattered in a tapestry of loans and credits, the outcome was predictable, particularly in Germany's case. The German government simply could not pay the reparations in any timely and meaningful fashion, and began deliberately to inflate its currency, paying the Allies back with increasingly worthless Reichsmarks, and ruining its own economy in the process as factories shut down and unemployment soared. It was clear that something had to be done, and the only country at that time that could do it was the only creditor nation in the world with enough liquid capital worth anything to loan, the United States. It is in this context that the 1924 Dawes Plan and the 1928 Young Plan emerged as the latest scheme of international capitalists to milk Germany for all she was worth, for the ruin of the Reichsmark provided them with a golden opportunity to float profitable loans with valuable American dollars to the German cartels in the United States. Both of these plans were engineered by these central bankers, who manned the committees for their own pecuniary advantages. And although technically the committees were not appointed by the US government, the plans were in fact approved and sponsored by the government. The essence of both plans was that the large US central banks floated German bond issues which were paid for by American dollars. In turn, part of these funds were then used by Germany to repay the war reparations imposed by the Versailles Treaty. Under these two plans, Germany paid out to the Allies about 86 billion marks in reparations. At the same time, Germany borrowed abroad, mainly in the US, about 138 billion marks, thus making a net German payment of only 3 billion marks for reparations. Psych. Consequently, the burden of German monetary reparations to the Allies was actually carried by foreign subscribers to German bonds issues by Wall Street financial houses at significant profits for themselves, of course. As will be seen in a moment, much of these funds were actually used by the German corporations, borrowing them to create the cartel system that dominated late Weimar Germany and that continued throughout the Nazi era. It was the Young Plan, however, that began the process of waking German capitalists and industrialists up to the threat, for it was a clever and insidious adaptation of this bonds for loans scheme that constituted the Dawes Plan, for under the 1928 Young Plan, named after its sponsor Owen Young, the bonds were conceived as a device to occupy Germany with American capital and pledge German real assets for a gigantic mortgage held in the United States. There was, of course, predictably a loophole granted to this scheme, for German firms with U.S. affiliations evaded the plan by the device of temporary foreign ownership. Thus, the Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, or AEG, German General Electric, which was of course affiliated with General Electric in the United States, was sold to a Franco-Belgian holding company and evaded the conditions of the Young Plan. AEG was also the German firm that built the power plant for the Nazi Bell device, but America's internationalist, capitalist, socialist elite had not banked pardoning the pun on one thing, and it is a lesson they seem to have forgotten. Not all German cartelists and industrialists were loath to abandon patriotism or pride in their culture and nation. Indeed, German steel magnate Fritz Thyssen observed that he turned to the National Socialist Party only after he became convinced that the fight against the Young Plan was unavoidable if complete collapse of Germany was to be prevented. Clearly, if all real German assets were tied up in international agreements that were essentially mortgages, and these in turn were woven into an intricate pattern of mounting debt, then Germany's days as a sovereign nation were numbered. Thyssen's comment also contains an implied warning about the activities of the post-war Nazi International, for if the international corporate elite was slow to appreciate the dangers of their activities in fomenting a resistance movement within its own ranks, and slow to appreciate the dangers of nationalist backlash in its ranks. The Nazis were not only alive to the possibility, but also learned to exploit those internationalist leanings within the global financial world for themselves. In any case, the American loans that were floated to German cartels under these plans were enormous. AEG received $35 million from National City Co., the enormous German steel cartel Vereinigte Stahlwerke United Steelworks received $70,225,000 of underwritten securities from the Wall Street firm of Dillon, Reed and Co., an American IG Chemical. IG Farben's American subsidiary was the go-between for a loan of $30 million from National City Co. What this meant in terms of German business was that two of these three giant cartels, IG Farben and Vereinigte Stahlwerke, were able to control almost all business related to German war-making industrial potential by the mid-1920s. These two cartels represented the core of Nazi Germany's military-industrial complex. In brief, in synthetic gasoline and explosive, two of the very basic elements of modern warfare, the control of German World War II output was in the hands of two German combines created by Wall Street loans under the Dawes Plan. IG Farben, in fact, dates from 1925 when its chairman, Hermann Schmitz, created the giant cartel by merging six already giant German chemical companies: Badische Anilin, Bayer, Agfa, Höchst, Weiler Thermea, and Griesheim Elektron. By 1928, Schmitz had organized its American holding companies, American Bayer, General Aniline Works, Agfa Ansko, and Winthrop Chemical into a parent Swiss holding company, IG Chemie. And in 1929, all these firms were merged to become American IG Chemical Corporation, later renamed General Aniline and Film. But this barely scratches the surface. Between 1927, only 2 years after the founding of the cartel, and the outbreak of the war in 1939, IG Farben had more than doubled in size. The Wall Street financiers who made the loans to Hermann Schmitz to form this cartel had indeed created a monster, and that monster, in turn, was not proving to be as cooperative or pliable as they might have wished. By 1939, IG acquired a participation and managerial influence in some 380 other German firms and over 500 foreign firms. The Farben Empire owned its own coal mines, its own electric power plants, iron and steel units, banks, research units, and numerous commercial enterprises. There were over 2,000 cartel agreements between IG and foreign firms, including Standard Oil of New Jersey, DuPont, Alcoa, Dow Chemical, and others in the United States. The full story of IG Farben and its worldwide activities before World War II can never be known, as key German records were destroyed in 1945 in anticipation of Allied victory. In any case, these cartel arrangements were used by IG Farben to prepare Germany for war, both by acquiring technologies from abroad under licensing agreements, but also to deny Germany's enemies the ability to rely on similar technologies in their own war production. Under Farben's licensing agreements, the giant cartel obtained from Standard Oil of New Jersey America's process for making synthetic gasoline in return for a license to Standard Oil for Farben's synthetic rubber or Buna making technology. But the power of the corporation was such that, while it used Standard Oil's technology to make gasoline and oil for Hitler's tanks, bombers, and warships, it denied the Americans the ability to produce much-needed synthetic rubber, throughout and right up to the very end of the war. Additionally, Farben's global extent and penetration into foreign firms also provided it with a ready supply of very reliable intelligence on Germany's enemies' war production capabilities and production runs, affording Germany a very clear picture of her enemy's military intentions. But the important point to notice here, and it is one that Farben's elitist Wall Street backers only hints at, is that IG Farben, while a multinational global corporation in every modern sense, was a corporation acting always around a solidly German core and in the German national interest. These arrangements were used by IG Farben to advance Nazi policy abroad, to collect strategic information, and to consolidate a worldwide chemical cartel. It was a lesson the Nazi International would learn well. So organized was Farben's intrinsic rebellion against the very American international financial interests that set it up, that it had its own espionage office, its Berlin NW7 office. This unit operated under Farben director Max Ilgner, nephew of IG Farben president Hermann Schmitz. Max Ilgner and Hermann Schmitz were on the board of American IG, with fellow directors Henry Ford of Ford Motor Company, Paul Warburg of Bank of Manhattan, and Charles F. Mitchell of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Given Farben's behavior as a German multinational cartel, the presence of these prominent American executives on its American subsidiaries board can only represent the presence of dupes. Farben was playing Wall Street for all it was worth. Indeed, Farben far exceeded Wall Street's desires simply to have Nazi Germany act as a counterbalance to Soviet Russia, for it did more than just comply with orders from the Nazi regime. Farben was an initiator and operator for the Nazi plans for world conquest. In fact, the German army only rarely had to approach Farben. It is estimated that about 40 to 50% of Farben projects for the army were initiated by Farben itself. Farben was not content to play the Wall Street role of geopolitical counterbalance, and when Nazi Germany had overrun most of Europe by May of 1941, it was clear even to the Wall Street blockheads that had put both into power, that both monsters, Nazi Germany and IG Farben, had to be put down. But putting it down was not going to be easy. For consider all that has been stated thus far in terms of what power IG Farben actually wielded. It had penetrated the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Charles Mitchell and Paul Warburg, penetrated Ford Motor Company Henry and later Edsel Ford, penetrated the Bank of Manhattan Paul Warburg, and Standard Oil of New Jersey, just to mention a few. Interesting things to mention is that of the more prominent Farben intelligence workers in NW7 was the Netherlands' Prince Bernhard, the founder of the famous Bilderberg Group. Another American multinational corporate giant that supported the Nazi Party was IT&T, founded in 1920 by Sosthenes Ben. While there is no evidence that IT&T supported the rise of Hitler prior to the war to the extent that other Wall Street firms did, IT&T certainly supported him during the war, since it made payments to none other than Heinrich Himmler via various IT&T German subsidiaries. More importantly, through its purchase of a large interest in the German Focke-Wulf Aircraft Company, IT&T was making profits from the German Focke-Wulf 190 fighter, Germany's most numerous and successful fighter, the better of the British Spitfire and the near equal of the American P-51 Mustang. With the prominence of the Bush family in American politics and scandals, from savings and loan scandal to the JFK assassination itself, where a G. Bush is mentioned in connection with trying to warn about the assassination, to the possible involvement of G.H.W. Bush in the October surprise affair, his role as an ambassador to Red China and helping broker the Nixon-Mao agreement that would ship American factories, jobs, and technology to that country, his role as a former director in the CIA, and his family's business ties to the Bin Laden family of Saudi Arabia, and of course to his and his sons' questionable legacies as presidents of the United States, and also as members of the famous Skull and Bones secret society at Yale University, it should come as no surprise that his family also has a connection to the rise of Nazism under Adolf Hitler. While there is no suggestion that Prescott Bush was sympathetic to the Nazi cause, the documents reveal that the firm he worked for, Brown Brothers Harriman, acted as a U.S. base for the German industrialist Fritz Thyssen, who helped finance Hitler in the 1930s before falling out with him at the end of the decade.
From The Guardian.
Come.
The Guardian has seen evidence that shows Bush was the director of the New York-based Union Banking Corporation that represented Thyssen's U.S. interests, and he continued to work for the bank after America entered the war.
The Guardian has seen evidence that shows Bush was the director of the New York-based Union Banking Corporation that represented Thyssen's U.S. interests, and he continued to work for the bank after America entered the war. That said, however, there was enough evidence in declassified U.S. National Archives documents to prompt one former U.S. war crimes prosecutor to argue that the late Senator Prescott Bush's action should have been grounds for prosecution for giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Whatever the legalities of the hypothetical case may be, and there are many, the documents themselves tell an interesting story. There are three basic sets, the first dealing with the Harriman Company and Prescott Bush's role as a director and shareholder in several Thyssen-controlled firms. The second set of documents relates to the seizure of company assets in America that were fronts for German firms, the Union Banking Corporation, the Holland American Trading Corporation, the Seamless Steel Equipment Corporation, and the Silesian American Company, all of which were ventures tied to Prescott Bush. The third set of documents relates specifically to I.G. Farben and its ties to Thyssen's Silesian steel and mining operations. Prescott Bush's business dealings with the Nazis hardly have the door about them that those other Wall Street firms and personalities already mentioned. It is only when viewed in a much wider context of the Bush family's contacts and business dealings that Prescott Bush's activities with Thyssen might be seen as part of a larger pattern. And then there is that matter of the Bush family's purchase of a ranch, not in the USA, Canada, Australia, or the usual contenders, but in Paraguay. Perhaps they like the scenery. Or perhaps they want to be near old family friends. If there is a lesson to be learned from I.G. Farben's story, then it is one all-weather corporate financiers or ordinary men should learn, and that is that the best-laid plans of international bankers with a global agenda not only can backfire, they can backfire in the major ways called Nazi Germany, I.G. Farben, and World War II. But there was another lesson to be learned from I.G. Farben's success story as the world's first real major military-industrial complex, for its pattern of internationalization of the Nazi ideology around a solidly German core would be well learned by the man who had the most high-level day-to-day contact with it, Nazi Party Reichsleiter Martin Bormann. Just how closely he followed the Farben model of internationalizing the ethnic character of post-war Nazism around a solid German core, and using Farben's pattern of cartel arrangements, corporate interlock and penetration, and blackmail, and the well-placed assassination or two, remains to be seen.
The beginnings of evacuation. Operation Fireland.
The military disaster of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-1943, Martin Bormann and other top Nazi leaders began the quiet, tough, disorganized flight of capital from Nazi Germany to safe havens abroad, an operation codenamed Action Feuerland, Operation Fireland. The treasure consisted of hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks, boxes and boxes of gold and platinum, pearls and diamonds, crates full of the priceless art of Europe, and billionaire bundles of stocks and other securities. The loot was amassed in a series of bank safes and underground vaults throughout the Reich, until Martin Bormann was made aware of its existence by one of his many internal intelligence conduits. In late 1943, he took control of much, though not all, of this bounty, and informed Hitler of its existence and a plan he had formulated for its conservation. "Bury your treasure, for you will need it to begin a Fourth Reich," Hitler had responded. With this blessing, Bormann took control of as many as 6 U-boats, some of them unmarked, from Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, and garnered the support of Generalissimo Francisco Franco to headquarter the U-boats in the Spanish port cities of Cadiz and Vigo. The U-boats for the next 2 years, supplied by cargo planes from Germany that transported the treasures to the coastal towns on the Atlantic, began a non-stop circuit transporting the treasure to the far southern reaches of Argentina, the region known as Tierra del Fuego, or Land of Fire. At their destinations, they were unloaded by Bormann's mysterious minions and deposited into a variety of international bank accounts controlled by a cryptic cabal of Bormann partners. This was Operation Fireland. With Action Feuerland, one sees the outlines of the post-war Nazi evacuation taking shape. As Party Reichsleiter, Bormann headed the Nazi Party's Auslands organization, the overseas party offices and network established prior to the Nazi assumption of power to keep Germans abroad abreast of developments in the party, and of course, to keep a watchful eye on their activities and that of their host countries. In short, the Nazi Party leadership gave Bormann access not only to all of Nazi Germany's political, military, and financial wheeler dealers, it also gave him control over its own independent party international espionage and fifth column network. Most importantly, all German businesses abroad were required, once the Nazis took power, to have their own Nazi Party Auslandsorganisation liaison men. In particular, all employees of the big three German banks, Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, and Commerzbank, were required to be party members. In this way, Bormann had up to the minute an excellent intelligence on the international machinations of the global corporate elites. But it was Bormann's friendship with IG Farben directors Hermann Schmitz, Max Ilgner, and others that gave him access to Farben's far more extensive industrial espionage network, and that additionally provided him with the corporate networks needed to make his flight capital plan work. One city in particular was a veritable beehive of banking activity on behalf of IG Farben, Vereinigte Stahlwerke, AEG, Merck, Siemens, and other big German cartels. Buenos Aires. With the financial and corporate knowledge Farben placed at his disposal, with the control of the Nazi Party's own considerable finances and plunder, with his own party network of agents and enforcers in place, Bormann now had a vast overseas financial and commercial network to do his bidding. On August 10, 1944, an SS staff car flying the Nazi swastika and SS flags from its bumpers pulled up in front of the Hotel Maison Rouge, located on the Rue des Franco-Bourgeois in Strasbourg, nestled along the French banks of the Rhine River. It carried one SS Obergruppenführer Scheid, who doubled as Dr. Scheid, director of the industrial firm of Hermerdorf and Schönberg Company. Dr. Scheid had been ordered to chair a top-secret conference of German industrialists at the picturesque Alsatian city by none other than Reichsleiter Martin Bormann himself. The steps they undertook to put into place at the conference concerned more than just Germany, but indeed the whole post-war political and economic future of Europe, and for that matter, of the Nazi Party itself, and its goals and policies. The flight capital plans were variously known as Action Regentröpfchen and Action Adlerflug, Operations Raindrop and Eagle Flight, respectively. Scheid began the conference by informing the attendees that the Battle of France was lost, and that all industrial plants as could be evacuated to Germany were to be so.
The Hotel Maison Rouge, as it is still seen to this day in Strasbourg, Alsace, France.
After some perfunctory and obligatory remarks about the necessity of defending the West Wall and the Reich itself, Scheid settled down to business. From now on, he told the attendees, German industry must take steps in preparation for a post-war commercial campaign, with each industrial firm making new contacts and alliances with foreign firms. This must be done individually and without attracting suspicion. However, the party and the Third Reich will stand behind every firm with permissive and financial support. By pledging party financial support, Bormann was signaling to his corporate representatives that he was, in effect, buying shares in their enterprises and wanted intelligence from them in return for that support. Scheid informed the attendees that Bormann had suspended the 1933 law known as the Treason Against the Nation Act, which mandated the death penalty for violation of foreign exchange regulations or concealing of foreign currency. The implied threat was simply that Bormann, through his network of intelligence contacts and agents, could easily remove any corporate executive or director that he wished if these implied directives were not complied with. After delivering this implied threat, Scheid continued,
The ground must now be laid on the financial level for borrowing considerable sums from foreign countries after the war.
In other words, the war was lost, and German firms had to plan for the rebuilding of Germany, all with the tactic approval of Bormann and the party. As an example of the kind of support that had been most useful to Germany in the past, Dr. Scheid cited the fact that patents for stainless steel belonged to the Chemical Foundation, Incorporated, New York, and the Krupp Company of Germany, jointly, and that of the United States Steel Corporation, Carnegie, Illinois, American Steel and Wire, National Tube, etc., were thereby under an obligation to work with the Krupp concern. He also cited the Zeiss Company, the Leica Company, and the Hamburg America line as typical firms that had been especially effective in protecting German interests abroad. Note carefully what Scheid has disclosed about the method the party was encouraging German corporations to use. They were to use existing license, patent, and cartel arrangements to leverage borrowing power and influence abroad, shades of IG Farben. And to the assembled corporate representatives, the lesson could hardly have been lost on them. It was to be an expansion, on a far grander scale, of the pre-war machinations of the Dawes and Young plans that led to the creation of IG Farben in the first place. Negotiate, penetrate, infiltrate, and cartelize all transfers of technology, with German and party interests solidly at the core. These were the watchwords of Bormann's emerging Nazi International. Dr. Scheid departed back to Germany to spread the word quietly to all concerned firms of the results and expectations of the conference, while a smaller conference reconvened in the afternoon under the chairmanship of Dr. Boss of the Armaments Ministry. This afternoon session is even more revealing of Bormann's thoughts, intentions, and grand design. In attendance at this afternoon session were only 3 corporate representatives for Krupp, Hecko, and Rechling. Dr. Bosse then made some interesting remarks, beginning by restating Bormann's belief that the war was all but lost, but that it would be continued by Germany until certain goals to ensure the economic resurgence of Germany after the war had been achieved. He added that German industrialists must be prepared to finance the continuation of the Nazi Party, which would be forced to go underground. Bosse continued by outlining the way in which the Nazi Party and German corporations would liaise and what their goals were to be.
From now on, the government in Berlin, meaning Bormann of course, will allocate large sums to industrialists so that each can establish a secure post-war foundation in foreign countries. Existing financial reserves in foreign countries must be placed at the disposal of the party in order that a strong German empire can be created after defeat. It is almost immediately required, he continued, that the large factories in Germany establish small technical offices or research bureaus which will be absolutely independent and have no connection with the factory. These bureaus will receive plans and drawings of new weapons, as well as documents which they will need to continue their research. These special offices are to be established in large cities where security is better. Although some might be formed in small villages near sources of hydroelectric power, where these party members can pretend to be studying the development of water resources for the benefit of any Allied investigators. Dr. Bosse stressed that knowledge of these technical bureaus would be held only by a very few persons in each industry and by chiefs of the Nazi Party. Each office would have a liaison agent representing the party and its leader, Reichsleiter Bormann. As soon as the party becomes strong enough to re-establish its control over Germany, the industrialists will be paid for their effort and cooperation by concessions and orders.
At both morning and afternoon conferences, it was emphasized that the existing prohibition against the export of capital is now completely withdrawn and replaced by a new Nazi policy, in which industrials with government assistance Bormann to be the guiding leader will export as much of their capital as possible. Capital meaning money, bonds, patents, scientists, and administrators. Bosse urged the industrialists to proceed immediately to get their capital outside Germany. The freedom thus given to German industrialists further cements their relations with the party by giving them a measure of protection in future efforts at home and overseas. From this day, German industrial firms of all rank were to begin placing their funds and, wherever possible, key manpower abroad, especially in neutral countries. Dr. Bosse closed the meeting, observing that after the defeat of Germany, the Nazi Party recognizes that certain of its best-known leaders will be condemned as war criminals. However, in cooperation with the industrialists, it is arranging to place its less conspicuous but most important members with various German factories as technical experts or members of its research and designing offices. All this implies something very obvious and very significant. Martin Bormann fully intended to survive the war in order to coordinate all these activities. Also, note again the implied threat in Bosse's remarks that the freedom thus given to German industrialists further cements their relations with the party by giving them a measure of protection in future efforts at home and overseas. Bormann, in other words, is playing the old organized crime game, offering protection, implying also the threat to use force against those very industrialists if they do not comply, and placing his party organizations considerable international reach at their disposal if they do. With the Strasbourg Maison Rouge meeting concluded, Dr. Bosse then telephoned Martin Bormann in Berlin over secure SS lines to inform him that all attendees, not surprisingly, had agreed to the terms and conditions of the conference. Bormann's next move, however, is revealing for what it says about the nature and mechanisms he hoped to use to construct his underground Fourth Reich and Nazi International, for he then telephoned Georg von Schnitzler, one of the members of the Central Committee of Directors of IG Farben. Von Schnitzler informed Bormann that the post-war dependency of the victorious Allied countries on IG Farben would be so great that despite German defeat, IG, in one way or another, could regain its position of control of the European chemical business. Thus, even as German troops fell back from France and the Low Countries before the Allied advance, German industrialists, at Bormann's behest, were busily buying major blocks of stock in French, Belgium, Dutch, and Luxembourg firms. And never one to ignore or forget a detail, Bormann saw to it that his own personal records were shipped to South America, thus indicating again his determination to survive the war. These records would ensure that his network of Nazi Party corporate liaisons, intelligence agents, and financial agents would run smoothly. As a result of the Strasbourg meeting, Bormann in turn established 750 camouflaged corporations under the names of companies or individuals for which he held power of attorney, and therefore over which he had total control, as vehicles for managing the income of the flight capital program. These businesses were scattered across countries throughout Europe, the Mid-East, and Latin America. Holdings were even kept in bank accounts in the United States of America. As a result of Bormann's operations, the Nazi Party liaisons established with the corporate world at the Strasbourg Maison Rouge meeting were able to penetrate 11 nations' economies, including Germany's, and to significantly influence them in the post-war world. By the time of the European war's end, Bormann's Nazi International had already rat-holed $800 million plus 95 tons of gold. So the conclusion is that Martin Bormann was the central player at the Strasbourg conference. The second is that Bormann most likely escaped Germany at the end of the war and lived for many years rebuilding and controlling the economy of West Germany and much of Europe and Latin America, and that he did all this with the protection, support, and collusion of the United States government. The efforts were designed to achieve a quick German rebirth and eventual European economic domination by Germany. Strategies for covertly redeploying the economy also included a European Economic Community that positioned Germany as the hub and rag-bearer of a confederated Europe that would predominate by elastic political methods, not with brutal force. These elements are certainly recognizable in the history of post-war Europe as it actually unfolded, and in fact, Germany continues with a high profile in the European economic model of today, which is truly a European economic community. The evidence reflects that the Flight Capital Program and Bormann's partnership with IG Farben not only paid off as planned, but it set the foundation for the European economy we know today, and by extension that of the world. Bormann and his links to Germany today are a hidden but a very real political issue. Bormann's strategy was a corporate version of the Blitzkrieg itself, for by employing massive amounts of false fronts, dummy corporations, interlocking personnel in directorships with no known ties to major Nazi business combines, by using massive amounts of corporate fifth columns, Bormann hoped to orchestrate a vast network of corporate confusion that would take armies of finance agents and lawyers and years, if not decades, to sort out. The picture of Bormann, the corporate manipulator that emerges from these considerations, however, should give one pause, for with Bormann one is dealing with the likes of a John D. Rockefeller or J.P. Morgan, but without their own ethical constraints, which were not that many to begin with. Bormann had indeed not only positioned his Nazi International as a major global manipulator alongside of those older vested international corporate and banking interests, he had to a certain degree also succeeded in penetrating them and using them for his own purposes. So my conclusion is, Martin Bormann not only survived the war, but did so in the company of other men such as Heinrich Müller and Hans Kammler, whose presence in the Nazi International indicate that its objectives of independent Nazi control over the most advanced and arcane areas of physics research were alive and well, along with the men who coordinated them, secured the projects, and enforced the Nazi International's policies abroad.
Martin Bormann first, Heinrich Müller second, Hans Kammler third.
Much of the most highly classified Nazi secret weapons research, including their most highly classified weapon, the Bell, was coordinated by a super-secret think tank housed within the engineering division of the Skoda munitions works in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. SS Obergruppenführer Dr. Ing-Hans Kammler headed the think tank. Born on August 26, 1901 in the German Baltic port city of Stettin, Kammler held a doctorate in engineering, and by dint of his command of all German secret weapons research and of the SS Building and Works Department, could tap into a slave labor pool of perhaps as many as 14 million people. Within the Skoda works, Kammler had established a think tank whose mission brief was to map out technology trees for first, second, third, and even fourth generations of weapons of every conceivable variety, including nuclear weapons and weapons far more destructive. Since Kammler also spoke Czech, his choice of Skoda inside of Bohemian Czechoslovakia to headquarter his think tank was entirely logical, for Bohemia had been made a Reich protectorate and fell under the immediate jurisdiction of the SS. The SS had, in effect, turned all of Bohemia into a military reservation which to enter or leave required proper SS authorization and clearances. The SS had in effect turned a whole country into the Nazi equivalent of the Nevada test ranges. And within this already cloistered country, Kammler had turned the engineering division of the Skoda works into the nerve center of a vast secret weapons empire, a veritable rat's run of underground laboratories and production facilities, many of which were never even known to Allied intelligence until after the war. This think tank existed behind a triple belt of security. The Kammerstab security itself was the last piece of the puzzle, because Kamla security was never breached. It was not breached by the US, British intelligence, or even Soviet intelligence, which thought they knew everything. Kamla was able to pull a cloak of obscurity over himself and his staff using a triple wall of counterintelligence units, the Political Counterintelligence Unit and the Industrial Counterintelligence Unit. This security arrangement was so successful that when the Allies began advancing into Germany in the early spring of 1945, nobody asked the local population anything about Kamla or the Kamla Group. Neither side knew anything at all about it. By the time the boots on the ground realized who Dr. Kamla and his organization really were, his very name became a forbidden subject. This was probably so lest the other Allied powers, especially the Soviets, learn of any potential treasure trove of scientific secrets. Moreover, this triple belt of security not only answered to Kamla, but to another notorious figure in the Third Reich, Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, and whose very nickname Gestapo Müller says it all. In any case, Kamla's think tank was never penetrated. If there was to be a post-war Nazi international continuing to develop its own secret projects, it would need lots of money and someone who knew how to handle it. Bormann, it would need lots of security and someone who knew how to run it. Müller, and lots of engineering expertise and management experience in coordinating large projects and keeping them secret. Kamla. Toward the end of the war, we find Bormann giving direct command of all of Germany's heavy lift aircraft, the Luftwaffe unit Kampfgeschwader 200, to Kamla, which he then most likely used to smuggle himself and Nazi Germany's most sensitive secrets, including the Bell, out of Europe. Small wonder, then, that suspicions always abounded after the war that Bormann and Müller had also escaped after carefully contriving their deaths.
254th Contact Tuesday, the 28th of November 1995, 2333 HRS.
These flying gyroscopes had already been further developed in Germany and achieved test flights that produced good results.
Today's South American group?
Your assumption is correct.
And all this could happen under the eyes of the Gestapo?
Many of the major Gestapo and SS leaders were involved and secretly working to keep the rest of the world ignorant of the constructions and test flights, etc. And when the end of the war came, they fled to South America with all their material and all their people. This was not a difficult undertaking for them, because the flying gyroscopes were already so airworthy that they could circumnavigate the Earth non-stop and transport away all materials and people before the Allied forces could seize them or find out anything about these secrets.
However, it must be said that there is also other evidence on how major Gestapo and SS leaders fled to South America, maybe even without the help of the flying gyroscopes as mentioned above in the contact report. Bormann gave Kamla the control over Germany's last remaining Ju-390. Allegedly, only 2 Ju-390s were ever built, the only plane capable of flying a heavy load, the Bell and/or its priceless project documentation, without stopping from Europe to Latin America. Classified intelligence reports from Argentina and Poland suggest that the second Ju-390 was flown to a jungle airstrip in Entre Rios province, Argentina, in May 1945, and was then broken up on a German-owned ranch in Uruguay, with parts dumped into the Rio Pirana, near Paysandú. The likely location for a jungle or bush airstrip appears to have been in the upper reaches of the Rio Pirana between Uruguay and Argentina, possibly around Concordia.
Junkers Jew, 390 feet 1 on the ground. From German Wikipedia, Junkers_Jew, _390.
Bormann's Nazi International would need as a base of operations, given the intention to continue independent research and given a presumptive intention to orchestrate economic and political events for an eventual recrudescence of Nazism. Bormann would need a neutral country large enough and with enough wilderness or remote areas to safely house large amounts of people. Similarly, it must also be accessible. The government must be friendly to Nazism and amenable to a large Nazi presence. The country must be technologically sophisticated, enough to support whatever scientific research projects the Nazi International wish to accomplish, or able to import sophisticated equipment via German business contacts when needed. There must be a sufficient territory within the country to hide such project, or at least keep it as far from public scrutiny as possible. Thus, on this view, even nationalist Spain is out, as is Sweden, Portugal, etc. In short, a European base for the Nazi International, much less any research project it may wish to continue, is out of the question. There must be sufficient German business penetration to permit the easy transfer of funds into and out of Nazi accounts, and also permitting the liquidation of harder assets into liquid capital. And there is one more item to add to the list, given the Vatican's well-known participation in helping fleeing Nazis. It most likely will be an area with a predominantly Roman Catholic population.
When one considers this list, Latin America immediately offers itself as a fulfillment of most of the criteria. However, the requirement of a Nazi-sympathizing government narrows the list down substantially to Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, and to some extent, Brazil. And of these 5, there is one in particular that stands out, Argentina, but more about that in Part 2.
236th Contact Thursday, the 26th of April 1990, 003 HRS.
Who is behind this? And why did one once again want to make me have a Nirvana ride? Apparently some heroes are involved again, who are located somewhere in the Milky Way, because the Earthlings do not have such technological possibilities as you mentioned them in your explanation. Or should the Brazilian minions or the heinous ones of Argentina and Bolivia be behind this? But no, they should not even have such possibilities, right?
533rd Contact Thursday, the 5th of January 2012, 2304 HRS.
What about the fact that the Earthlings have also been watching me, the various military and secret services, as well as that group in South America, which emerged from fugitive Nazi engineers, which built flying discs in Germany and then later in the USA and in South Africa? I knew about that, but is there anything special about it, in particular whether such flying discs are still being produced today and whether they still fly around the world?
None of this has changed. Not even the fact that certain states continue to work within the same framework, and that the Nazi flying apparatus technology captured by the war victors continues to be worked on, as do many descendants of Nazi engineers who have been trained as engineers and who can also work on Nazi techniques relating to flying discs, etc., and show good results.
Mainly in South America, but probably not only in one country, right?
That is correct.
Source: Nazi International, The Nazis' Post-War Plan to Control Finance, Conflict, Physics, and Space, by author Joseph P. Farrell, published in 2009. Nazi International, Part 2, by Berk Gumus, September 26, 2023.
Strange activities in Argentina.
President and Generalissimo Juan Domingo Perón was nothing if not intensely patriotic and flamboyant. His influence and effect on the development of Argentina as a regional power was lasting, and endures to such an extent that if one says South American dictators, many people to this day think first of Perón. Few people realize, however, the depth of his relationship with the post-war Nazis or the degree of cooperation and funding he gave them.
Juan Domingo Perón.
Dictator Juan Domingo Perón played a crucial role in ferrying Nazis to his country and giving them asylum. The rat lines would not have been successful without the involvement of a major Latin American government with the resources to harbor hundreds, if not thousands, of Nazis. Even Bormann's plans for ongoing Nazi research could not have been accomplished without the help of the Argentine dictator. Whenever and for whatever reasons Perón first developed his sympathies for Nazism and the Third Reich, there can be no doubt that these crystallized when the young Perón, then an officer in the Argentine army, was sent on a tour of Europe in 1938. Sent to tour various European countries as a military observer, cultivated many contacts in fascist Italy and Germany. However, Perón was also present in Europe in 1942, receiving special military training in Mussolini's army. Perón was granted an audience with Pope Pius IV, Eugenio Pacelli, and met Argentine's special diplomatic envoy Juan Carlos Goyeneche, who had been sent on a special mission to Berlin by then Argentine President Castillo. Castillo's regime in Argentina began to court the Axis powers. The Axis powers Germany, Italy, Japan were opposed by the Allied powers led by Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. 5 other nations joined the Axis during World War II: Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Croatia, and particularly Nazi Germany, during the Axis high tide of the summer of 1942, as Hitler's armies continued lunging deep, the Soviet Russia and Rommel's Africa Corps raced across the Libyan and Egyptian deserts. Castillo, a weak civilian president, walked a diplomatic tightrope, carefully maintaining a facade of neutrality, while his leading civilian and military advisers circumvented normal diplomatic channels and sought direct contact with Berlin. In this case, the normal diplomatic channels were circumvented by a special Argentine envoy, a young Catholic nationalist whose grandfather had once been president of Uruguay and whose father had been mayor of Buenos Aires prior to the Second World War. The envoy's name was Juan Carlos Goyeneche, and he was a close friend and confidential agent of Colonel Juan Domingo Perón. Additionally, Goyeneche had cultivated close contacts among the Foreign Intelligence Branch of the SS, which had a heavy human on-the-ground presence in Argentina prior to and during the war. This network of agents was connected to Berlin via an array of secret transmitters known as the Bolivar Network that covered much of the country. In 1942, Goyeneche departed for Europe via nationalist Spain, whence he travelled onward to fascist Italy. There, using Argentine diplomatic contacts in Spain, he was able to develop close ties to Giovanni Cardinal Montini, at that time working in the Vatican Secretariat of State. It should be noted that it was Montini who would eventually be elected Pope Paul VI and preside over the conclusion of the Second Vatican Council. In early January 1943, as the German military situation at Stalingrad was reaching its disastrous denouement, Goyeneche visited Heinrich Himmler at the latter's Eastern Front headquarters. The conversation was of a general nature, though Himmler asked Goyeneche to convey a favorable impression of the Reichsführer to Pius V on the latter's upcoming visit to Rome. From Berlin, Goyeneche returned once more to Madrid, where he lunched with Spain's foreign minister, Ramon Serrano Suna, discussing his impeding visit to Pope Pius XIII and Benito Mussolini. The Argentine special envoy's purpose was to organize a conference of pro-Axis Catholic delegates from Vichy France, Hungary, Romania, Slovenia, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, who would meet in Rome to integrate the Christian order in the new order. Journeying on to Rome, Goyeneche met twice with Giovanni Cardinal Montini, and then with Pope Pius XIV, who urged Argentina to preserve its neutrality. The Pope went so far as to draft a message in support of Argentina's neutrality. After this, the special envoy met with Benito Mussolini, who communicated fascist Italy's secret support for a coup. On June 4, 1943, all these maneuverings on the part of Peronist Goyeneche, the Axis, and the Vatican were finally rewarded when a group of colonels led by Peron finally overthrew Castillo, ejecting him from the presidential mansion, the Casa Rosada. However, it is worth noting the outlines of the post-war Nazi international that began to take shape during this time period when the military initiative passed irrevocably from the Axis to the Allies in the wake of the disaster at Stalingrad and the British victory at El Alamein in North Africa. As was seen above, the most likely initial purpose of Goyeneche's visit to Germany in 1942 to 1943 was to solicit German support for just such a coup, and further, to enter a secretive support with the Axis powers. Dissuaded in this course by Ribbentrop's diplomatic answers, Ulrich Friedrich Wilhelm Joachim von Ribbentrop was a German politician and diplomat who served as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Nazi Germany from 1938 to 1945. The next best thing was concluded: the installation of a pro-Axis neutral regime in Buenos Aires. The Argentine effort was fully complicit in the attempt to internationalize Nazism by linking to the various pro-Nazi factions in the various puppet governments of Europe, and this effort centered furthermore on tacit Vatican support. Once Peron's colonels were in power, moreover, secret collaboration began in earnest. A partnership with Argentina's military had already been formalized. As he told American interrogators after the war, SD Chief Walter Schellenberg had approved an agreement for mutual collaboration in May 1943. It included freedom from arrest for Nazi agents in Argentina, camouflage identification for them as members of the Argentine Secret Service, the use of the Argentine diplomatic pouch for transporting secret material between Buenos Aires and Berlin, and even an early warning system in case of a cabinet crisis that could endanger German agents. In return, Argentina's military were allowed access to the powerful radio communications network of the Nazi Secret Service, were provided with information culled from Nazi sources in Argentina's neighboring countries, and were promised collaboration in forming an Argentine-led South American bloc of nations, the creation of a third position between the two likely post-war power centers of the United States and the Soviet Union. Indeed, Juan Perón began discussing the idea of what he called third position, between the far right's capitalism and the far left's communism, with his future foreign minister as early as 1947. So committed to this vision was Perón that he and his intelligence chief Rodolfo Freude invited the pro-Nazi sympathizer and Belgian Rexist Day to meet with Perón personally after the latter had overtly assumed power in Argentina. Both Perón and Freude were impressed with Day's own attempts to cultivate such political views among his own contacts in Argentina and Europe, and were particularly interested in Day's group's objective of creating a movement to unite all those in the world who do not support either of the two formulas offered to the masses. Belgian Rexism was Belgium's equivalent of Croatia's Ustashi, Spain's Phalangists, Italy's fascists, and of course, Germany's Nazis. It was one of the many exported versions of Nazism inculcated deliberately by the Nazis in their occupied territories in Europe. American democratic capitalism, which declares itself the champion of freedom and the defender of private property, and Bolshevik Russian communism, the destroyer of private capitalism, but also the destroyer of all individual freedom. Direct German support for Perón came after the war's end. In 1945, 246, when Rodolfo Freude's father, Ludwig, a longtime personal friend of Perón with proven Nazi links, had channeled large contributions from Argentina's German business community into Perón's 1945 to 1946 presidential campaign, seeming to confirm the rumors that the colonel was in the pay of the Nazis. An American counterintelligence report from the period stated that Rodolfo Freude was financing Nazi resistance throughout the world. Moreover, rumors circulated that Hitler's deputy Martin Bormann was in hiding in Argentina and working with Freude. So close was the relationship between Perón and his spy master Freud that, when a momentary coup against Perón's puppet, Edelmiro Farrell, landed Vice President Perón in jail, it was Rodolfo Freud and a convenient uprising of Perón supporters that toppled the coup and propelled Perón to his 1946 election victory.
Rodolfo Freud is second from left with Perón.
Once in full power, Perón established 3 separate routes for his rat lines: the northern route via Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, the Swiss route through Switzerland, and the southern route via ships departed from Genoa, Italy, with Vatican diplomatic passports and false identities provided by the Archbishop of Genoa, Giuseppe Cardinal Siri. Perón's own objective in creating these rat lines was to recruit technicians for his ambitious program of aeronautics and the development of modern jet fighters for Argentina's Air Force. Indeed, some of his first recruits were pro-Nazi French jet designer Émile de Voisin and Germany's equally capable Kurt Tank, an engineer for Focke-Wulf. Hovering over all this activity is, of course, the shadow of Martin Bormann and the possibility that he did escape, along with his plunder, from Europe. There is also evidence that this in fact occurred, and it comes from a rare post-war document of Argentina's Central de Intelligence. It is a bank account statement of a joint account held by Perón and Bormann, listed by national currencies.
Bormann's and Perón's joint bank account statement.
What Bormann and Perón did with all this money, and several kilograms of gold, platinum and diamonds, can be seen in Perón's hasty proclamation in 1951 that Argentina had learned to control thermonuclear fusion by alerting the world press to its secret project in Huemul under the direction of Nazi physicist Ronald Richter. The Generalissimo, it seemed, was after the power of the stars and of hydrogen bombs, the first of which would be detonated in the Pacific a little over a year after Perón's announcement. If so, then Dr. Richter had succeeded in a matter of a few weeks of moving to Argentina from regional power to the first thermonuclear power in the world. As soon as Perón and Richter made the announcement, it was being denounced in the United States by heavy hitters from its Atomic Energy Commission. Shortly thereafter, Dr. Richter and his team retracted the announcement by exposing themselves and claiming that their experiments did not go as claimed by intentionally calling attention to misplaced scientific equipment in his experiments. Richter was most likely following instructions from elsewhere to shut the project down by any means possible. Richter was involved in something entirely different, something extremely sensitive. Then Perón's announcement to the Argentine press could only have drawn attention to something that others did not wish known, and the only way to deflect that attention would be to have the whole thing declared a fraud. These instructions came in the form of the visit to Argentina of the Dutch scientist Professor Cornelius Jan Bakker. Professor Cornelius Jan Bakker, leading Dutch nuclear physicist, arrived at Huemul Island under a dense cloak of secrecy. He was apparently brought in as a result of recent talks between Perón and the Netherlands' goodwill ambassador, Prince Bernhard. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands is perhaps best known for his role in the founding of the so-called Bilderberg Group, as mentioned briefly in Nazi International Part 1. But there is a much more sinister side to Prince Bernhard. Bernhard was a former member of the Nazi SS and an employee of Germany's IG Farben in Paris. In 1937, he married Princess Juliana of the Netherlands and became a major shareholder and officer in Dutch Shell Oil, along with Britain's Lord Victor Rothschild. Many have written about the conspiratorial aspects of the shadowy Bilderberg Group, but few have noticed the ominous implications of its premier founder, Prince Bernhard himself. As a native of Germany and a member of the SS and employee of the notoriously powerful German chemical cartel, IG Farben, it is possible that the post-war founding of the Bilderberg Group is but another piece of the puzzle of post-war Nazi survival and the plans of the Nazi International. Succinctly, it is possible that the Bilderberg Group was created, in part, in order for the post-war Nazi International to monitor, penetrate, and influence the plans and machinations of one of their chief rivals for power, international corporatists and globalists. In other words, with Prince Bernhard's IG Farben connection, we have a tenuous connection between Richter's Bariloche fusion project and the wartime atomic research of Nazi Germany. With these revelations, Perron's consultation of a Dutch nuclear physicist assumes its ominous aspect. For having received a blunt denial of Richter's claims from his own scientists, Perron is appealing to a former Nazi, Prince Bernhard, for an audit of Richter's notebooks and claims. It is perhaps quite significant that it is after this audit that the project is supposedly shut down, for nothing appears to be forthcoming in the record about what Professor Bacher found, nor what he reported to Perron or Prince Bernhard. After that, the US Air Force would continue to collect and quietly evaluate as much data on Richter and his work as it could. When Richter shared some of his experimental results with dictator Perron, however, the project security was very nearly blown. For Perron's response, his infamous press conference of 1951, was hardly anticipated by Richter or his hidden Nazi masters, one of whom was most likely Martin Bormann himself. With world attention focused on Argentina, on Dr. Richter and on the Huemel project, the decision was taken to discredit Richter and the whole enterprise publicly. And Richter and his team were given their orders that scripted their carefully anomalous behavior that guaranteed the project's demise. Richter was doing specific research in 1943 for the Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, or AEG, in Berlin, the German firm that built the power plant for the Nazi Bell device. So one can imagine what Dr. Richter was really working on.
Details of the Nazi Bell.
In August of 1997, Polish journalist, military historian, researcher and author Igor Witkowski claims to have been shown classified prisoner interrogation transcripts of German SS General Jakob Sporenberg by a Polish intelligence agent. What Witkowski discovered seemed to be official evacuation protocols for a secret Nazi research project concerning a device named Die Glocke, which he referred to as the Nazi Bell. Given the highest top-secret classification by the German W3 military of Krieg entscheidend, or war decisive. In the book The Truth About the Wunderwaffe by Igor Witkowski, published in 2013, he writes that the Bell, in the initial period of development at the AAEG in Berlin, only hovered above the ground and just rose and fell without being able to perform any maneuvers. He states that the Bell glows with a sort of pale bluish glow and made a buzzing sound, which is why it was nicknamed Der Bienenstock, the beehive. It is further said that the Bell was connected by electrical cables to installations on the ground. The device allegedly worked with counter-rotating magnetic fields and a substance called Zerum 525, a cherry-red, viscous substance, possibly enriched mercury. Witkowski points out that the genius of the Nazi scientists was that they constructed a plasma trap that caused the plasma to rotate. An ordinary plasma trap does not do that. He concludes that the scientists made the plasma rotate in a plasma trap because they were involved in some kind of torsion physics. And the first thing Dr. Richter said he did in his Huemel thermonuclear fusion experiment for Peron was that he worked with rotating plasma. And he did it in such a way that he pulsed the plasma with surges of electricity. The original Bell project of the AEG and Richter's own theoretical rationalizations of the Huemel project both happen to refer to hyperdimensional physics, the unified field theory, zero-point energy, high-spin, high-turbulence plasma shock waves, electrical pulsing, and rotating plasma. And taken into consideration along with Bormann's suspicious presence in the very same region, then the conclusion seems all but certain. The post-war Nazi International was continuing the development of the very technologies that gave them control of the energies of the very fabric and structure of space-time itself. Energies and technologies that would alter the very structure of world finance, geopolitics, technologies that held such horrendous weaponization potential that it would make an H-bomb look like a firecracker, and they weren't about to let anyone else have it.
Ronald Richter left, with Juan Domingo Perón right.
Wikipedia information.
The Huemel project was an early 1950s Argentine effort to develop a fusion power device known as the thermotron. The concept was invented by Austrian scientist Ronald Richter, who claimed to have a design that would produce effectively unlimited power.
511th Contact Sunday, 25th of December 2010, 1304 HRs.
This also involved Nazi engineers who were acquitted of their Nazi past in the USA and became American citizens. These, like the Nazi engineers who had fled to South America, also continued to work on the development of disc bell and balloon-shaped flying apparatus, which were airworthy and with which extensive test flights were carried out.
A strange presence in Bariloche.
A glance around the environs of Bariloche, Argentina will show just how heavy the German influence there was and is, for the architecture is distinctly German, from the houses to the hotels, etc. There is even, in this remote, rugged and beautiful place in Argentina, a German cultural center.
German-style houses in Bariloche. German public architecture in Bariloche.
One of the biggest mysteries in Rio Negro province, however, was a large hotel, discovered by Shark Hunters founder Harry Cooper. Shark Hunters was an international group of veterans of the submarine services of World War II, and in particular was dedicated to detailing the history of the U-Boot-Waffe of the German Kriegsmarine. While on a visit to the Rio Negro province, Cooper found this large hotel of distinctly German architecture in a town so small that its mere presence is enough to raise eyebrows. The hotel was far away from anything. It was built before and during the war. Cooper discovered that the hotel was the scene of gatherings of German veterans on April 20th every year, Adolf Hitler's birthday. More importantly, according to people Cooper interviewed, General Eisenhower even visited the hotel sometime during or around 1954. But that's not all, for according to the people interviewed by Cooper, the motel was originally built as a large plastic surgery clinic.
The lobby of the plastic surgery clinic cum hotel in the area of Bariloche.
If all this be true, then one is able to conclude that the Bariloche area had become the new Vatican for post-war Nazis fleeing Europe, the headquarters of their covert projects, from providing new identities and faces to its clients to conducting some very advanced scientific research. Adding considerable weight to the idea that the environs of Bariloche had become something of a headquarters for the post-war Nazi International, and to the idea that Richter's Huemel fusion project comprised something more than just an effort to control fusion, and that something else may have been going on in addition. To that something cleverly suggested, and just as cleverly disguised by Richter's theoretical explanations, in terms of the actual physics being investigated, is the alleged presence in Bariloche province, after the project was shut down, of none other than the Nazi Party Reichsleiter and the de facto leader of the post-war Nazi International, Martin Bormann. Paul Manning, a journalist and longtime associate and friend of the famous CBS newsman Ed Morrow, mentioned Bormann's presence in Bariloche province, but did not connect his appearance with the Richter fusion project. Manning begins by noting that President Truman himself became involved in the hunt for Bormann in 1948, 3 long years after Bormann supposedly died trying to escape Berlin. According to the official Standard history, on June 16, 1948, President Truman became involved in the hunt for Martin Bormann. Robert H. Jackson, who had once taken a leave from the Supreme Court to serve as U.S. Chief Prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, wrote to the President that a quiet search should be made by the FBI for Bormann in South America. My suggestion, therefore, he wrote, is that the FBI be authorized to pursue thoroughly discreet inquiries of a preliminary nature in South America. I have submitted this summary to Mr. Hoover, and am authorized to say that it meets with his approval. You may inform him of your wishes directly or through me, as you prefer. The choice of the FBI to do the investigation is perhaps significant. Under American federal law, after Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947 that created the CIA and NSA, the FBI was restricted to intelligence operations on American soil. All operations on foreign soil fell under the jurisdiction of the CIA. So why would Jackson have urged President Truman to undertake an investigation in South America through the FBI? After all, Truman himself signed the law into existence and knew full well its contents. The answer lies once again in the fact that the CIA, which under Zurich OSS Station Chief Alan Dulles during the war had negotiated a highly secret deal with the head of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front, General Reinhard Gehlen, to turn over, lock, stock, and Nazi Gehlen's entire network to the nominal oversight of the American intelligence community, leaving Gehlen in charge of its actual day-to-day operations. In other words, before the ink was even dry on the National Security Act of 1947, the CIA's civilian character had already been compromised in the most egregious way, since its entire operational desk in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and to a great extent elsewhere as well, was staffed by a network of Nazis. Needless to say, then the CIA would not be the best instrumentality to investigate Bormann's possible presence in Latin America. Jackson's request also suggests something even darker, that both he and Truman knew of the extent of Nazi penetration of the CIA, and therefore of its untrustworthiness as an investigative agency for post-war Nazi activity. In any case, as Manning observes, the presidential authorization was given, and John Edgar Hoover assigned the investigation to his most experienced and skillful agent in South America, who proved that he was just that by eventually obtaining copies of the Martin Bormann file that were being held under strict secrecy by Argentina's Minister of the Interior in the Central de Inteligencia. When the file was received at FBI headquarters, it revealed that the Reichsleiter had indeed been tracked for years. One report covered his whereabouts from 1948 to 1961 in Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and Chile. The file revealed that he had been banking under his own name from his office in Germany in Deutsche Bank of Buenos Aires since 1941, that he held one joint account with the Argentinian dictator Juan Perón, and on August 4th, 5 and 14, 1967, had written checks on demand accounts in First National City Bank Overseas Division of New York, the Chase Manhattan Bank, and manufacturers Hanover Trust Co., all cleared through Deutsche Bank of Buenos Aires. Bormann's wartime contact with Deutsche Bank bigwig Dr. Hermann Apps and the connections to the international financial interests of Morgan and Rockefeller via their big New York banks was paying big dividends. For Bormann, quite apparently, did not even have to hide his identity, but could sign and cash checks under his own name through some of the largest and most well-known banks in America as late as 1967. But what Nazi activities were left for Bormann himself to coordinate in Bariloche, when the only known Nazi activities ever centered there were precisely Dr. Richter's controlled fusion project for Perón, and since Perón had long since ostensibly closed the project down? Bormann did much more, however, than merely visit Bariloche after the Huemul-Richter affair. It was, until Perón's ouster from power in 1955, his headquarters, for as Manning notes, he had moved to a 5,000-acre cattle and sheep ranch about 60 miles south of San Carlos de Bariloche, where he remained until Perón was overthrown. Bormann had bunkered down, in other words, very close to the center of an ongoing post-war Nazi atomic research project of some unknown nature, and that fact highlights the possibility that the project was extremely important and sensitive to the post-war Nazi international, and that it required a source and amounts of funding other than Perón, which only Bormann could provide. In other words, Dr. Richter's Huemul fusion project was most likely an extension and continuation of some aspects of the Bell project, Nazi Germany's most highly classified secret research project.
Things to know.
50th Contact Tuesday, 6th April 1976, 0137 HRs.
It was one of those groups that got their hands on plans by which they were able to produce beamship-like flying objects.
You are referring to the German flying saucers.
Certainly. However, their ships are still quite primitive and not space-capable. So they are still Earthbound. But here they have all kinds of possibilities. These Earth humans are also one of those groups that approach Earth humans and claim that they come from the stars with their saucer-shaped flying objects and are extraterrestrials. But this group is no longer in Europe, but like other groups in the South American region.
Pay attention to that was said in the 50th Contact report shown above. These Earth humans, the Nazis that escaped to SA, are also one of those groups that approach Earth humans and claim that they come from the stars with their saucer-shaped flying objects and are extraterrestrials. As, for example, the case of Reinhold O. Schmidt.
Wikipedia information.
According to Schmidt, on November 5, 1957, while driving through a rural area near Kearney, Nebraska, he saw a large, blimp-shaped object on the ground in a field. He claimed 2 men left the object and escorted him inside it. On board witnessed a group of 4 men and 2 women speaking a language he described as High German. The group claimed to be from the planet Venus. After a conversation lasting about 30 minutes, Schmidt left the craft and it took off into the air, revealing large propellers at each end.
Reinhold O. Schmidt from a 1957 interview, and a sketch based on his description of the alleged UFO.
See also the Kecksburg UFO incident and the similarities to the Nazi Bell A model depicting the alleged crashed object and put on display near the Kecksburg fire station.
Source: Nazi International, the Nazis' post-war plan to control finance, conflict, physics, and space, by author Joseph P. Farrell, published in 2009. The Truth About the Wunderwaffe by Igor Witkowski, published in 2013. Guest author. Nazi International, Part 3 by Berk Gumus, Oktober X, E.
Wartime and post-war Nazi collaboration with Arab states and radical Islam.
The genesis of the cooperation between militant Islam and the extreme right can be traced back to the early years of the Third Reich. During World War I, much of the Islamic world sympathized with the Axis alliance. Members of the Muslim Brotherhood would often say prayers for an Axis victory during their meetings. Moreover, some Muslims went so far as to fantasize over putative Islamic affinities of fascist leaders. For example, rumors abounded that Benito Mussolini was an Egyptian Muslim whose real name was Musa Nilil Moses of the Nile, and that Adolf Hitler too had secretly converted to Islam and bore the name Haider, or the Brave One. After the promulgation of the Nuremberg race laws in 1936, which denied German citizenship status to Jews, the Nazi Reich received telegrams of support from throughout the Muslim world. The Third Reich's interest in the Muslim world, however, would not begin until 1937 with the publication of a report by the British Royal Commission, which explicitly recommended for the first time the partition of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. This prompted the German Foreign Ministry, which feared a Jewish state could become a base of operation for international Jewry along a similar basis as the Vatican City State, to examine ways of increasing support for the purpose of strengthening the Muslim world as a counterweight against such a possible increase in power for world Jewry. These methods included overt diplomatic overtures to more covert support for radical Islamic groups. Attention was paid to 3 countries in particular on the peripheries of the British Empire, strategically positioned to threaten sensitive British interests: Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan.
Iraq.
German interest in the country began long before the Nazi Party took power. Nazi interest in that country, then under strong British influence, dates back to the 1920s, when the National Socialist Party was still in its infancy. Not surprisingly, one finds the character of Detlef Schmood, a main player in the Nazi Party's secret society Becker, the infamous Thule Gesellschaft, a member as well in von Liebenfeld's order of the New Templars ONT, and an editor of the Thule Society's magazine Ostara, settling in Tabriz, in neighboring Persia.
Emblem of the Thule Society with 1 circle and a rounded swastika. Flag of the Order of New Templars, Ta Nazir Counts, Ujursa Group.
There he based his next few years. Search for the hidden masters. Someone of Schmood's importance and position within these groups suggests that he was the point man for gathering facts and information for them. Then, in 1933, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris' Abwehrabteilung, Germany's military intelligence, dispatched Dr. Paul Leverkusen to the Middle East to cultivate allies among the Muslim populations under British rule or influence. His headquarters was also Tabriz in Persia. But most interestingly, his most highly placed recruit was none other than pro-Nazi Iraqi Prime Minister Rashid Ali, overthrown 2 years later by the British invasion of Iraq. Canaris's network of Abwehr agents inside of Iraq was taken over by Himmler in 1944 after Canaris' implication in the bomb plot against Hitler in July of that year. Strangely enough, Himmler placed these agents under the control of none other than Baron Rudolf von Sebottendorf, one of the principal founders of the Thule Gesellschaft to begin with and, like Schmoody, a member of von Liebenfeld's Order of the New Templars. This implies that the real basis of Nazi networks in Iraq was grounded in the secret society network in the region, perhaps initiated by Schmoode. What happened to this Thule SS network in Iraq after 1945, no one knows. However, it is interesting to note that von Sebottendorf's body was found floating in the Bosporus in Istanbul in 1945 after the war's end. However, it must be added that there are rumors that Sebottendorf was allegedly murdered by a secret sect from Istanbul. But the question remains open whether this really corresponds to the truth. As indicated, Nazi interest in Iraq stemmed in part from the covert and hidden occult influences at work in the secret societies that midwifed the Nazi Party into existence, influences that later extended into the upper echelons of Himmler's SS. But here it is important to note the political aspect of German involvement. For with German support, Rashid Ali staged his now famous coup. It was an act that directly threatened Britain's oil lifeline. Britain had to respond, and did so with an invasion that topped the regime. The British invasion did not, however, succeed in rolling up the Nazi espionage network, for that was based in Iran, as was seen. The Iraqi coup was aided by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who in 1939 was in Baghdad, meeting with the Committee of Free Arabs. There he discussed the plans for the coup with the group of colonels leading the committee. The Mufti was at it again in 1940 when he was in Berlin, signing an Axis Arab Manifesto of Liberation, in which both fascist dictators expressed their strong support for an independent, united Arab nation. What emerges from this is a pattern of Nazi and German support for and exploitation of Arab and Muslim aspirations against the imperialism of oil, that is to say, Britain and the United States.
Adolf Hitler talking to Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini left? The Grand Mufti and SS Commander Heinrich Himmler right.
Iran.
Iran played its own peculiar role in Nazi Muslim contacts. In Persia, a nationalist general, Shah Reza Pahlavi, who seized power in 1925, was an admirer of Adolf Hitler's racial policies and even went so far as to rename his country Iran, which translates into Aryan in Persian. During the Shah's reign, until overthrown by British and American troops in 1941, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem briefly took refuge in the country, as will be seen below.
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan was another country to which Nazi Germany made serious diplomatic advances throughout the 1930s. These, as elsewhere in the Muslim world, were successful, and Germany succeeded in establishing very cordial relations with the Afghani government. So good were relations that the Nazis that they even attempted to establish a political alliance with Mullah Mirza Ali Khan, who, along with his Wazir Mujahideen, resisted British rule of the northwestern province of Afghanistan from 1937 to 1947. Nazi envoys successfully contacted Islamic guerrillas in the British zone of Sarhad, bringing with them a letter of support from Adolf Hitler. This time, however, the embassy was ambushed by the British and Afghani border police. The king, whatever his pro-Nazi sympathies might have been, was well aware of what had happened to Iraq and Iran, and decided to expel all German and Italian diplomats from his country. As has been seen, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, played a prominent role in Nazi plans for the region. Having signed the Axis Arab Manifesto of Liberation in Berlin in 1940, the Grand Mufti once again made his way back to the Middle East, first headquartering himself in Baghdad until the British coup overthrew the pro-Nazi government, forcing al-Hussein to flee to Nazi-friendly Iran, until again forced to flee by the arrival of British and American troops and the installation of a pro-Allied puppet government in Tehran. Al-Husseini made his way back to the one country and city in which he knew he would be welcome, and where he would remain until the war's end. Nazi Germany and Berlin. There, among other activities, in aid of the Nazi radical Muslim cause, he helped form the Arab League in 1944. According to researcher George Michael, the Grand Mufti has his own hands bloody in the Holocaust, for he played a significant role in discouraging the Nazi regime and the pro-Nazi governments of Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria from allowing Jewish emigration to Palestine. More importantly, al-Husseini, while still resident in Jerusalem, received a special envoy from Nazi Germany in 1937, one of whose members was Adolf Eichmann. The purpose of the special embassy to al-Husseini was to discuss the possibility of Jewish emigration to Palestine. Husseini, of course, discouraged this. As Michael also notes, there is evidence of limited cooperation between the Nazi regime and Zionists themselves in this matter. From Christopher Simpson's book, Blowback, it is known that Heydrich's RSHA and he, Gestapo, helped Fivl Polkes train Jewish guerrillas at camps inside the Reich for armed terrorist actions against the British Mandate in Palestine. The famous Jewish playwright Van Hecht also documented in his book Perfidy the case of the trial of a Jewish doctor in Israel in the 1950s for his role in rounding up Hungarian Jews and shipping them to their certain murder at Auschwitz. And there are even larger issues and little-known facts than this that lurk beneath the sporadic but murderous Nazi-Zionist cooperation, which would require an article in its own right to explore.
The First Suicide Squad and the Muslim Waffen-SS.
Among the more active material assistance the Grand Mufti gave to Hitler was his active recruitment among Bosnian Muslims for volunteer soldiers for the Muslim Waffen-SS Handschar Division. Husseini also made pro-Axis broadcasts to the Arab world from Nazi Germany and wrote a book, Islam and the Jews, a motivational treatise designed to incite Muslim hatred of Jews, and as it turned out, Orthodox Christian Serbs, and motivate Muslim volunteers to assist in the Nazi slaughter. For his efforts, the Nazi regime made him the Supreme Sheikh-ul-Islam, the Supreme Chaplain for Nazi Germany's Waffen-SS Muslim legions. If the Nazi regime's evaluation is any indicator, al-Husseini was a definite asset to the cause.
Amin al-Husseini inspects the Handschar Division on 13. January 1944. SS Handschar Troop Badge.
Indeed, in one sense, the Grand Mufti succeeded in opening the floodgates of Muslim manpower to the Axis. For as late as 1945, units of volunteer Muslims were raised from Chechnya and other regions far behind the front lines in the Soviet Union, and were organized into 19 independent Islamic combat battalions and 24 infantry companies in the Wehrmacht. Furthermore, Muslim Turks and Tatars were organized into a Waffen-SS division known as the Osttürkisches Waffenverband, East Turkish Armed League, and SS Waffengruppe Turkestan SS Armed Turkestan Group. Some of these units operated behind Soviet lines as anti-communist partisan groups, while several Muslim units participated in crushing the Jewish uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. The Grand Mufti certainly delivered not only manpower, but experience for such activities, for he is also credited for helping to organize long before the ties. For he is also credited for helping to organize long before the war the first modern Fedayeen, suicide squads, which primarily targeted moderate Arabs who refused to support his agenda. Not surprisingly, then, the Grand Mufti appears to have figured in the Nazis' post-war calculations. Remaining in Germany until just 3 days before Hitler's suicide, the SS contacted the Mufti and offered him an airplane by which to escape from Switzerland. Al-Husseini refused, apparently preferring to make his way to the neutral country by means of a car which he had purchased for the purpose. The SS hoped that al-Husseini would eventually make his way to North Africa, where he had established spy networks that were still extant. In point of fact, the Grand Mufti did indeed eventually end up in Egypt, where he had a great influence on emerging Arab leaders, and no doubt also helped organize radical Islamic guerrilla and suicide units, for among those he influenced was his distant cousin Yasser Arafat, founder of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Additionally, there is evidence that the Mufti also was directly involved in the organization of Fatah, the PLO's militant and terrorist arm. Just how al-Husseini was able to do all this without significant financial support is a moot point, for as has been seen, Bormann's emerging Nazi international not only had money, but had lots of it.
Yasser Arafat, 1970, left. The official emblem of Fatah, right?
The fact that al-Husseini was offered direct SS assistance as the Reich collapsed, and with the mad scramble of Nazis trying to flee the country and acquire their own vehicles and airplanes already in scarce supply, is an indicator of just how highly ranked in the scheme of Nazi priorities for the post-war world he really was. Needless to say, the Mufti also helped organize rat lines for Nazis who fled to the Middle East, with significant post-war repercussions, as will be seen momentarily. Nazi participation was sought by post-war Arab leaders, was given by the Nazis themselves, and often with the quiet but very direct support of the West German government itself. Egypt's post-war leaders and their collaboration with well-known post-war Nazis is a significant case in point, and in it one may see the outlines of the Nazi International's post-war policies and politics at work. Egypt was, in fact, the one country that perhaps was the most deeply influenced by the Nazi regime, for as Field Marshal Rommel Afrika Korps drove ever deeper and closer to Alexandria and Cairo in early 1942, Egyptian Arab sympathies for an Axis victory were often openly expressed in British-occupied Egypt. Even King Farouk was supportive of the Nazi cause in spite of his rule being propped up by the British. Even with the war's end, populist Egyptian anti-Western sentiment against Farouk's rule had grown to such an extent that both the US and British governments decided that Farouk had to be replaced. At this juncture, events once again took a very strange turn. The CIA, under the influence of John Foster Dulles, selected Egyptian General Mohammed Naguib to lead a new Egyptian government. On July 22, 1952, with the help of the CIA, Naguib sent the army into the streets of Cairo and Alexandria and established himself as the commander-in-chief of military forces. Although Naguib was the titular head of state, unbeknown to the CIA, the real power ultimately rested with Lieutenant Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, who soon assumed the position of president. This coup was also significant because it opened the door for numerous Nazis to take prominent positions in the Egyptian government. As is known by now, the reality of the CIA's Soviet desk at that period of history was that it was being run on a practical level, and in terms of its human on-the-ground assets in Eastern Europe, by a group of Nazis still under the command of the wartime general in charge of German military intelligence on the Easter Front, Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen secretly negotiated with American OSS station chief in Zurich, Switzerland, Alan Dulles, to turn over to the Americans his entire network so long as the network remained in the day-to-day operational control of Gehlen himself. Before President Truman's signature was even dry on the National Security Act of 1947, which created the CIA, its civilian character and charter had already been severely compromised, since almost its entire operational and analytical Soviet desk, as mentioned above, was staffed by a bunch of former Nazis. The value of Gehlen's intelligence regarding foreign attitudes and intentions toward the USA was often specious at best. For Gehlen's intentional overestimation of Soviet military capabilities and intentions played no small part in the spread and enduring intensity of the early Cold War. Gehlen deliberately influenced post-war American military and geopolitical policy by overestimations. In other words, the deliberate overestimation and disinformation by Gehlen's organization of Soviet military and economic preparedness for war helped fuel the Cold War.
Reinhard Gehlen, 1943. It does make sense in the light of a presumptive post-war Nazi intention to exacerbate post-war East-West tensions in order to play one side off against the other, enhancing Germany's position in the process, and exploiting conflicts in other nations that such tensions would inevitably create. And exactly that was the case in respect to the days immediately following Nasser's CIA-sponsored coup. For suddenly, America's interests seemed to fall off Nasser's radar screen, only to be replaced by someone else's. Not long after the war, many German military officers and Nazi Party officials were granted sanctuary in Middle Eastern countries, most notable Egypt and Syria, where they helped develop the militaries and intelligences agencies of those countries. One of these officers who found sanctuary in Egypt was the unrepentantly Nazi general Otto Rehmer. Rehmer's presence is significant, for not only was he the founder of the thinly disguised neo-Nazi Socialist Reich Party in post-war West Germany, he was also the very general who crushed the coup attempt against Adolf Hitler in July of 1944 by maintaining Nazi control over the military units in Berlin. It was with General Rehmer's help, and that of former SS Commando Otto Skorzeny, that Nasser developed an Egyptian support base for anti-Western guerrillas in Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria, as well as for insurgencies in Aden and Kenya. Otto Ernst Rehmer in 1945 left. Skorzeny in 1943, right?
The post-war policy and agenda of the Nazi International was, in other words, the exploitation of anti-imperialist and nationalist insurgencies in the colonial empires of France and Britain. General Rehmer was the contact point between Nasser's Egypt and these guerrillas, for he arranged the trafficking of arms and training, often with former Muslim and German SS veterans, for these guerrilla movements. Skorzeny himself had arrived in Egypt in the early 1950s to lend his military expertise in the training of the Egyptian army and Muslim and other anti-imperialist guerrilla units. There he quickly formed a triumvirate with Nasser and the Grand Mufti in order to further their mutual goals. Not surprisingly, a young Yasser Arafat met the famous SS Commando colonel while being trained in unconventional warfare by the SS and developed a friendship that would reportedly last for many years. Skorzeny's principal responsibility was to train thousands of Egyptian commandos in guerrilla and desert warfare. Furthermore, he organized and planned the initial forays of the early Palestinian terrorists into Israel and the Gaza Strip around 1953 to 1954. An Arab Foreign Legion was created, whose nucleus consisted of 400 former Nazi veterans who were recruited by the Arab League agents in Germany. Finally, Skorzeny sought to protect German scientists, technicians, and engineers who were recruited to work on Egypt's special military program. Skorzeny coordinated all this military activity with yet another German military advisor in Nasser's Egypt, SS Lieutenant General Wilhelm Farnbacher. But what were all these German scientists, technicians, and engineers doing in Egypt to begin with? The clue is found in the presence in Egypt of none other than Dr. Wilhelm Voss, who had been sent to Egypt personally by West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer.
Wilhelm Farnbacher. Konrad Adenauer. Wilhelm Voss.
Dr. Voss was the civilian liaison inside the engineering division of the Skoda Munitions Work in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, and it is thanks to Voss's revelations to British journalist Tom Agostin that the existence of SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kamier's secret weapons think tank inside of the Skoda works was first publicly revealed. Voss was in Egypt coordinating the secretive West German technical assistance being given to NASA to develop his own missiles capable of targeting Israel and other neighbors, but he was also coordinating West Germany's economic assistance and trade with the new NASA regime. Indeed, his influence in the early years of NASA's Egypt was so sweeping that he was in fact the architect of the Egyptian economy in the early post-war years. But there's more, for according to George Michael and other researchers, it was Voss who, working with Reinhard Gehlen, Skorzeny, and Hjalmar Schacht, increased West Germany's trade with Egypt. Not only was Schacht present, but a former member of Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry was represented in the form of Johann von Leers, a former assistant to Goebbels himself. Once in Egypt, von Leers helped translate Mein Kampf into Arabic. One only need recall Saddam Hussein's copy in this regard, but also other Nazi classics, such as the notorious Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Johann von Leers in 1933. Hjalmar Schacht in 1931. Additionally, von Leers assisted NASA's regime in churning out an endless stream of torrid anti-Western and anti-Israeli propaganda. The sudden appearance of so many high-ranking and well-connected Nazis in NASA's Egypt was obviously by deliberate design. The presence of so many people, including Hjalmar Schacht, Reinhard Gehlen, and SS Colonel Skorzeny, in this venture can hardly be accidental. Schacht's activities in the Middle East also bear mentioning as well, for he or his hidden masters hardly restricted their economic vision to Egypt alone, for he was the major broker of the so-called Jeddah Agreement in 1954 between German industrial companies and Saudi Arabia. Under the protocols of this agreement, Saudi Arabia agreed to establish a fleet of supertankers to be built in German shipyards that would transport Saudi oil around the world. And as if that were not enough to convince the most hardened skeptic that all these connections can hardly be coincidental, the Greek magnate Aristotle Onassis was chosen to manage the shipping side of the arrangement.
Wikipedia information.
Aristotle Socrates Onassis, 20th January 1906, 15th March 1975, was a Greek and Argentine business magnate. He amassed the world's largest privately owned shipping fleet and was one of the world's richest and most famous men. On October 20th, 1968, Onassis married Jackie Kennedy, the widow of the assassinated American President John F. Kennedy. Aristoteles Onassis, 1967.
This deal, of course, directly threatened British and American oil interests in the region, for it threatened to end their own cartelization of the commodity and the Middle East's oil field. With the aid of the CIA, they succeeded in blocking the agreement. The very fact that the CIA was involved in this affair is an indicator that it was encountering very serious and blowback in its early backing of the coup that brought NASA into power in Egypt. The ultimate geopolitical goal for all these above-mentioned maneuvers was to form a third bloc, Shades of Juan Perón. See Nazi International Part 2. During this period, Renaissance Nazis saw the rise of Arab and Third World nationalism as an excellent opportunity to create a German Islamic neutralist alliance that would extend from the heart of Europe to the South China Sea. This idea was consistent with the late Karl Haushofer's policy of an alliance with the colored world. Karl Haushofer was Adolf Hitler's geopolitical guru and one of the salient influences on Hitler's geopolitical views as expounded in Mein Kampf. Haushofer is generally regarded as responsible for popularizing geopolitics. One vision of this new extreme right foreign policy was to create, with the assistance of the Grand Mufti and the Arab League, a German-Egyptian-dominated power bloc that could resist both the United States and the Soviet Union. This creation of a third bloc between the United States and Communist Russia was one of the major post-war goals of the Nazi International. For that bloc would inevitably have to be centered on Europe and on Germany's position as the still predominant European power. Needless to say, not all went according to the post-war Nazi plans for Egypt either, for under increasing pressure from the Soviet Union, Nasser went out of his way to alienate his West German allies by recognizing the government of East Germany. In response, West Germany retaliated by breaking relations with Egypt and withdrawing its technical and economic support. But even in these events, one discern a palpable Nazi influence at work. The presence of General Reinhard Gehlen's espionage network inside of Eastern Europe implies the possibility that this organization, the only intelligence organization with known connections both to the Eastern and Western blocs, have played a role in the secret coordination of Russian and American space activities. But to put it in this political context gives that possibility more significance, for as German foreign policy has consistently and historically played East and West off against each other, the post-war Nazi International, if it was to pursue a similar course of action, would have to have a presence in both blocs. Understandably then, some post-war Nazis promoted closer cooperation with the Eastern Bloc. One of these was an old friend and associate of Otto Skorzeny, himself a proponent of westward orientation, Dr. Fritz Grobber, who was Berlin's ambassador to Iraq and to Saudi Arabia prior to the Nazi-supported coup that overthrew the British puppet government in Baghdad. Indeed, he and the Grand Mufti had both collaborated in this design. But after the war, this former Nazi Middle Eastern ambassador and convert to Islam wound up as the director of Arab affairs at the Soviet Foreign Ministry in Moscow. And thus was the Soviet point man in brokering the first arms deal between the Soviet Union and Nasser's Egypt. Not only that, there is also evidence that at the same time that as Skorzeny acted as the liaison between the Nazi International, the Adenauer government in Bonn, and Egypt also thought to have helped Nasser's alliance with the Soviet Union.
Fritz Grobbe left, talking to al-Husseini.
To put it as succinctly as possible, Nazis were behind the overthrow of King Farouk and the installation of Nasser. Nazis were behind the training of his intelligence agency and army. Nazis not only helped guide Egypt's economy, but they were also behind NASA's alliance with the Soviet Union. Nor was this without immediate economic and geopolitical repercussions, for as is now known, with his Nazi-trained troops, Soviet weapons, and Nazi-manipulated new alliance with Moscow, NASA seized the Suez Canal and successfully expelled the last vestiges of French and British power and influence in Egypt. It is perhaps significant, then, that NASA eventually expelled the Soviets from Egypt, for if there was a hidden Nazi hand in the initial invitation, there may have been one in the expulsion as well. An international terrorists summit. In addition to direct post-war machinations in the various Middle Eastern nations, there was also an attempt to penetrate and coordinate post-war international terrorist activity as well. The Black International, which operated under the name of the European New Order, held a summit at Barcelona on behalf of the Palestinians. The organization was composed of various Nazis and fascists from Nazi Germany, Vichy France, Franco's Spain, Salazar's Portugal, Mussolini's Italy, and the Greek colonel's military junta. The Spanish leader, General Francesco Sicch, Franco, is believed to have endorsed the meeting. 2 representatives from Fatah, the military arm of the PLO, attended the event. Reportedly, the delegates discussed raising money, organizing the arms traffic, and providing ex-Nazi military instructors to help train guerrillas. A major endeavor was to recruit Caucasians to augment Fatah's forces in the Middle East and also collaborate in acts of sabotage and terrorism in Europe. Several summits followed this event, including one held on September 16, 1972, barely 10 days after Palestinian Black September terrorists killed 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics.
The September 18, 1972 cover of Time.
In other words, the now familiar pattern of internationalizing Nazism around a solidly German core was again in evidence, in a deliberate effort to coordinate European and Middle Eastern terrorist activity. These efforts knew no bounds. As is now known, many members of Licio Gelli's notorious P2G Masonic Lodge in Italy in the 1960s and 1970s had fascist and Nazi connections, and Gelli himself, in a less than coincidental and ironic parallel to the post-war Nazi ratlines, fled Italy to avoid prosecution. He went, of course, to Argentina. And one of the most notorious of these post-war terrorists, affiliated with a Nazi-sponsored secret society, was Mehmet Ali Agca, the assassin who attempted to murder Pope John Paul II in cold blood during a papal appearance at the Vatican shortly into the latter's pontificate. Agca was a member of a Turkish secret society called the Grey Wolves, a society founded by a former Turkish SS member and volunteer, Mehmet Kengeli.
Licio Gelli. P2 Masonic Lodge Ritual. P2 Masonic Lodge Emblem.
Roberto Calvi and the P2 Connection Wikipedia information.
The Propaganda du P2 organization was originally an Italian Masonic lodge that was misappropriated in the 1970s to disguise a secret political organization. In 1981, during an investigation of P2's activities, it became known that a conspiratorial network of police, military, business, political, mafia, and intelligence leaders had been created with the significant participation of Licio Gelli. Mafia and Secret Services. There was a serious suspicion that the secret society had developed plans for a coup d'etat and was linked to false flag terrorist attacks staged in the 1970s, which was later confirmed in judicial investigations. P2 was disbanded and banned in 1982. P3 was disbanded by authorities in 2010. The Propaganda Quattro Group, or P4, formed after the dissolution of P3, is headed by Gelli's lodge brother Luigi Bisignani. Its members are accused of betraying the results of an investigation, extortion, favoritism, and abuse of office. https://n. Wikipedia. Org, Wiki. Propaganda. Do.
Wikipedia information.
Roberto Calvi, 13th April 1920, 17th June 1982, was an Italian banker, dubbed God's banker, by the press because of his close business dealings with the Holy See. He was a native of Milan and was chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, which collapsed in one of Italy's biggest political scandals. Calvi's death by hanging in London in June 1982 is a source of enduring controversy and was ruled a murder after 2 coroner's inquests and an independent investigation. 5 people were acquitted in Rome in June 2007 of conspiracy to murder Roberto Calvi. Popular suspicion has linked allegedly corrupt officials of the Vatican Bank, the Sicilian Mafia, and the Continental Freemasonry Lodge propaganda due to his death. https://zim. Wikipedia. Org. Wiki. Roberto Calvi.
172nd Contact Sunday, 4th of July 1982, 11:03 HRs.
I have one more question. On the 18th of June, Roberto Calvi, the head of Italy's largest private bank, was discovered in London, hanging from a bridge. Did he commit suicide? Do you know anything about this?
I am oriented over it. The man did not commit suicide, but he was strangled, and this was in connection with a very intricate matter in which the Vatican and the secret services, and also secret lodges, played important roles. But about this, I want to tell you the following in confidence, which you must keep to yourself for the next 20 years.
Roberto Calvi.
Nazi-sponsored, Mehmet Ali Agca Wikipedia information. Assassination attempt on the Pope.
Agca carried out the assassination attempt on John Paul II in St. Peter's Square in Rome on May 13, 1981, using a pistol. 3 bullets hit the Pope, one of them seriously wounding him, while 2 bullets shattered his left index finger and grazed his right forearm. The 3rd bullet destroyed several loops of small intestine and eventually exited just beside his spine. Agca attempted to flee after the shooting, but was confronted by papal bodyguard Camillo Sibin and was arrested.
Reaction of Pope John Paul II.
The Pope caused a stir when he forgave the assassin while he was still on his sickbed in the Gemelli Clinic and visited him in prison 2 years after his recovery. Since the assassination fell on the 64th anniversary of the first Marian apparition at Fatima, John Paul II attributed his salvation to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and later thanked her with a pilgrimage to Fatima. Agca linked the assassination to Fatima at a court hearing in 1985 and referred to himself as Christ Reborn.
Pardon in Italy.
After being sentenced to life imprisonment in July 1981, he was pardoned on June 13, 2000, after 19 years in prison. Italian President Ciampi pardoned him at the request of the Pope, and Aga was extradited to Turkey. Mehmet Ali Agca and Pope Johannes Paul II. Emblem of the Turkish secret society, the Grey Wolves.
385th contact, Thursday, 21st April 2005, 22:35 HRs.
This article here. It's about the assassination of Pope John Paul II by Ali Agca.
Ta reads the short article.
Yes, that is true. Agca had, among other things, also Vatican insider help. But I am not allowed to give more information about that.
182nd contact, Thursday, 3rd February, 1983, 22:31 HRs.
Do you still remember the assassination attempt on the Pope?
How could I not?
Very well indeed. It was just a question because the consequences will continue for a long time.
You mean that the relevant things are not concluded yet and that even further impacts will arise from this?
That is correct, because in the middle of the year 1983, further consequences will arise in this connection. The assassin is to be set free as a result of extortionate kidnapping. Therefore, a younger girl will be kidnapped, so that the Italian government will be forced by extortion to release the murderer and assassin Ali Agca.
Nor were Turkey, Egypt, Palestine, and Iraq the only centers of pre- and post-war Nazi attention. Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, widely regarded during the 1970s and 1980s as a premier state sponsor of international terrorism, also had its own role. While there is no known direct connection between Gaddafi and post-war neo-Nazism, it is peculiar that Gaddafi, who attempted to orchestrate his own international terrorist organization, did so in conjunction with his elaboration of a foreign policy that attempted to combine into a broad coalition nations and groups seeking an alternative to the Western and Eastern blocs. Essentially, Gaddafi, who outlined his ideas in a treatise called The Green Book, attempted to combine nationalism, anti-capitalism, anti-communism, and anti-imperialism into a populist ideology. He called his idea third position Zim. As indicated before, this third position was a major theme in the designs of the post-war Nazi International. And that very position itself is the indication of a hidden, though very real, German guiding hand on the international geopolitical stage in the post-war world.
Source: Nazi International, the Nazis' post-war plan to control finance, conflict, physics, and space, by author Joseph P. Farrell, published in 2009.
Guest author:
Nazi International, Part 4 by Berk Gumus, October 19th, 2023.
Excerpt from Contact Report 832.
This is despite the fact that all Nazi criminals, absorbed by America after the World War, were actually direct or indirect murderers and the like, and got away without punishment as a result of being absorbed by the USA.
Now associated with the USA, their descendants have been and are now sneakily and slimily allying with America's hegemonic drive to wage a fourth and strange world war. Behind this, there is perhaps a new plan and delusion to spread Germany around the world again and to make everything German. Just as in the last World War, the Nazi army wanted to Germanize everything in the eastern countries.
The German White of Reneging Reunification.
Hardly had the Berlin Wall come down. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl's government told East Germany the way it's going to be. Then the newly reunified Germany began to revive some old, long dormant, but still festering traditional symbols. And one of the first traditional symbols to be revived, or rather reinterred, was Old Fritz, King Frederick the Great. At the stroke of midnight on August 17, 1991, a casket containing the bones of Frederick the Great was lowered into its original resting place at the Sanssouci Palace near Potsdam. The royal homecoming extravaganza, complete with black horse-drawn carriages, imperial flags, and a military honor guard, was broadcast live on German television. Chancellor Helmut Kohl and 80,000 others had come to pay their respects to the legendary Prussian monarch, who ruled an enlarged kingdom from 1740 to 1786. Several onlookers nodded approvingly at a sign in the crowd that read, "Prussia Lives." An ornate and lavish ceremony marked the end of a long odyssey for the body of old Fritz, whose remains had been spirited to Western Germany in the waning days of World War II to keep them from being seized by Soviet occupation forces. The collapse of communism rule in the German Democratic Republic paved the way for Frederick's return to his former dynastic retreat.
The burial place of King Frederick the Great on the 17th of August 1991.
Prussian King Frederick the Great, whose Eastern policy helped transform Prussia into a great power, and whose military reforms demonstrated Prussia's military prowess by fighting the superior forces of Austria and Russia to a standstill in the 7 Years' War, ended his reign with his country, the dominant military power in Central Europe. Frederick had introduced many of the traditions of the Teutonic Knights and most of the modern images associated with German military tradition.
Frederick the Great, 1763, left, / members of the Teutonic Knights right.
As the honor guard paraded with its World War I era imperial flags and regimental colors during the night hours, the imagery could not have been lost even on a casual observer. The new Germany was trying to identify itself with the old. Of course, Chancellor Kohl made the obligatory pro forma warnings about acknowledging the good with the bad, pointing out that Frederick, in addition to abolishing torture in Prussia and being a composer in his own right and a patron of the arts, had also developed the Prussian army and expanded Prussia's borders at the expense of Poland. No one seemed to have noticed, however, the bad side of Frederick was being honored with all the bad traditions of the Prussian military ceremonial Kohl had just cautioned against. Behind the symbolism, there lurked something else, for the newly reunited Germany was reviving not merely as many aspects of its traditional military pageantry as it could get away with, but the traditions of diplomacy, economics, and military muscle that Frederick epitomized.
Helmut Kohl in 1991.
President Jimmy Carter's former national security advisor and Polish émigré Zbigniew Brzezinski, himself trained by German historians, noted that the post-unification expansion of NATO had as much to do with Germany as it did making sure of Russia. By enveloping Germany in a wider Euro-Atlantic framework, NATO enlargement resolves Europe's central security problem of the 20th century, which has been how to cope effectively with the reality of German power. Whatever the value of Zbigniew Brzezinski's prognostications about the reality of German power may be, it will now be evident that the Nazi International was ahead of the game and, in fact, had anticipated this response. Moreover, they fully intended for it to come about. They not only helped orchestrate it and planned not only to be a part of it, but to lead it by positioning Germany at the core of a united Europe. In this context, it should not be surprising that Ursula von der Leyen is today at the helm of the European Commission, or maybe why Klaus Schwab, a child of Nazi Germany, is the head of the WEF, World Economic Forum. And when the Iron Curtain rusted away to be replaced once again by the Iron Cross, Germany not only rushed toward reunification Wiedervereinigung, but fully intended to exploit the power vacuum left in Eastern Europe by the Soviet departure and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. This exploitation would come in the form of German economic penetration and dominance of the region. By German diplomatic efforts designed to exploit ethnic divisions in polyglot nations such as Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, both fictitious nations created by and relics of the Treaty of Versailles, by cleverly recognizing breakaway nations and backing these up with German military force and the presence of significant numbers of German troops outside the borders of the fatherland for the first time since the Second World War. Consider the implications of the deal struck between Allen Dulles and Nazi military intelligence chief Reinhard Gehlen. The CIA was employing Gehlen's spies, many of whom were simultaneously members in the post-war neo-Nazi cells both in the eastern and western zones of Germany and Europe, organizations and cells that despised the United States. Their loyalty never initially belonged to the United States at all, it belonged to Nazi Germany. While the KGB thought it had turned many of Gehlen's agents against the West, those agents were able to pull off a convincing performance for their Soviet masters because their real allegiance remained where it started: Nazism. They played both sides for fools in a careful and delicate and patient dance, and taking their orders from the hidden directorate of the third position. At its height, Gehlen's organization had more than 4,000 agents inside of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and it was the de facto nucleus of NATO intelligence itself, supplying almost two-thirds of all of NATO's intelligence on the Warsaw Pact. In other words, the German BND was, and to a certain extent, is NATO intelligence. It is now well known that Gehlen's organization, after the conclusion of the notorious deal with Allen Dulles that transformed it into the operational Soviet desk in the early days of the CIA, deliberately fed disinformation to the USA in order precisely to whip up American fears of Soviet military capabilities and intentions, and accordingly drive the American military build-up and fan the fuels of an increasing debt load. Gehlen's strategy is based on a rudimentary equation: the colder the Cold War got, the more political space for Hitler's heirs to maneuver. He realized that the Nazi International could flourish only under Cold War conditions. As an institution, it was therefore committed to perpetrating the Soviet-American conflict. One of the most curious exercises of German military power outside German borders after the reunification was the deployment of the GSG-9, the same group that shot the hijackers of Lufthansa Flight 181 and rescued all its passengers in Mogadishu, Somalia, to rescue a German national in dubious circumstances, one Andreas Strassmayer. Only in this case, the GSG-9 was deployed not to an African third world country, but to the United States. Strassmayer's rescue by the GSG-9 was effected because of his involvement on the peripheries of the infamous Oklahoma City bombing. Strassmayer, according to eyewitnesses in Tulsa, Oklahoma had been seen in the company of Timothy McVeigh at the local strip bar called Godiva's on Sheridan Avenue by a local informant for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, Carol Howe. But what was so unusual about Strassmayer that would require the involvement of the German GSG-9 to get him out of the country? as the circumstances surrounding the OKC bombing began to be probed in the days and weeks immediately after the event by radio talk show hosts and independent investigative journalists, the riddles connected to the mysterious Mr. Strassmeyer only grew. One such radio talk show host, Chuck Harder of the People's Radio Network, reported on his show the strange events that unfolded in the immediate aftermath of the bombing that directly concerned Strassmeyer. According to Harder and his reporters, at a routine police roadblock near Muldrow and Rowland, Oklahoma, just over the border from Fort Smith, Arkansas, Strassmeyer was apprehended by local deputies for driving without a license or valid plates. According to some versions of the story, Strassmeyer also had with him an attaché case, which he refused to open and that he claimed were full of papers. Under the circumstances, the deputy, suspicious, incarcerated Strassmeyer in the local jail. Sometime later, the local sheriff's department, or, depending on the version of the story, local highway patrol, began to receive phone calls insisting that the sheriff release Strassmeyer. What made the calls strange, however, were that they came from no less than the then governor of Oklahoma, Frank Keating, and a Pentagon lieutenant general. Both insisted that Strassmeyer had diplomatic immunity and thus could not be arrested for anything. Then things began to get strange. As reporters probed further into this unusual McVeigh associate, they discovered that he had come to this country with the ostensible purpose of being a participant in Civil War battle reenactments. Strassmeyer told his lawyer that he merely was a Civil War enthusiast and a reenactor, and wanted to participate in the numerous reenactments at the historical sites. But the reality was quite different. Strassmeyer, it turned out, was a former lieutenant in the Bundeswehr, the German army, and moreover a graduate of Germany's prestigious Hanover War Academy, Germany's version of West Point, and had served honorably with the German army in its elite mechanized armored infantry units. Not only this, but Strassmeyer resided at Elohim City, a notorious white supremacist religious group in Oklahoma with its own deep and broad connections to a variety of underground American neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups. Moreover, Strassmeyer was the compound's security chief, who trained the group in survival tactics, small arms tactics, guerrilla operations, and so on.
Andreas Karl Strassmeyer.
The German paramilitary expert admitted in a court affidavit that he had met McVeigh at a Tulsa gun show shortly after the Waco massacre. Strassmeyer sold a combat knife to McVeigh and gave him his business card. That's as far as it went, according to Strassmeyer, who insists that he had no further dealings with McVeigh. While in Tulsa, Strassmeyer also visited the home of his beer-drinking buddy, Dennis Mahn, the Oklahoma-based Klansman who lit crosses in reunified Germany. And Mahn often spent weekends at Elohim City, boozing it up with Strassmeyer. Strassmeyer denies any involvement in the Oklahoma City attack. See article, The Military-Industrial Complex 2, to learn more about the possible sinister mind control machinations in context with Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bombing, and Nazi Germany. There is no doubt, however, that he had extensive links to America's violent racialist underground. Strassmeyer's roommate at Elohim City was Michael Brescia, who subsequently confessed to his own role as a member of the Aryan Republican Army, ARA, a fanatical white supremacist sect that sought to overthrow the U.S. government, purge the country of blacks and Jews, and install a new legal system based entirely on their own weird interpretation of the Bible. 4 of the 6 known ARA members lived at Elohim City, or often visited there. To raise money for the cause, the ARA robbed 22 banks in 8 Midwestern states during the mid-1990s. These armed assaults were carried out by ARA extremists who had been trained in weapons and guerrilla tactics by Strassmeer. The ARA's German paramilitary instructor managed to elude the long arm of the law, even though the Oklahoma State Patrol had issued a bolo be on the lookout alert for Andreas Strassmeer, which indicated that he was an armed and potentially dangerous illegal alien. Although several U.S. government agencies were aware of Strassmeer's presence at Elohim City, immigration authorities never tried to deport him. As the news reporters doggedly sniffed out the Strassmeer trail, however, it suddenly went completely cold. Until the young German suddenly showed up at his family home in Berlin, gave a brief press conference stating that he was indeed alive and well and not completely missing. After all, by that time, all of America's law enforcement agencies were looking for him and then faded quietly from view. So, what had happened between the mysterious phone calls to the local law enforcement in Roland, Oklahoma from Governor Keating and the anonymous Pentagon Lieutenant General, and Strassmeer's sudden reappearance in his native Germany? According to Strassmeer's close friend and American attorney, Kirk Lyons, a man not without his own connections to America's radical underground right and others, Strassmeer was spirited out of this country by none other than Germany's elite GSG-9 commando unit. Substantiating claims of Strassmeyer's possible deep involvement and connection to intelligence and elite paramilitary units, researcher Victor Thorne recounts two relevant incidents. Shortly after arriving in this country, Strassmeyer eventually made his way to Texas, where he aligned himself with a citizens' militia called the Texas Light Infantry Brigade. The only problem was, the members of the group quickly became suspicious of Strassmeyer's motivations and loyalty, so they followed him late one night to a federal building. There they saw Strassmeyer approach an electric lock on the door, upon which he punched in the code on an electronic keypad. And just like that, Strassmeyer gained access to the building. What makes this scenario relevant is that the federal building conveniently housed an office of the ATF. Anyway, after witnessing this transgression, the Texas Light Infantry Brigade gave Strassmeyer his walking papers for being a suspected undercover agent. There is one highly significant fact that places the story of the GSG-9 rescue of Strassmeyer in a very different light, making it not only possible that it was involved in Strassmeyer's rescue, but likely. When the Berlin Wall came down, and West Germany for all intents and purposes annexed East Germany, Andreas attended the reunification ceremonies with his father, Günther Strassmeyer, and Chancellor Helmut Kohl himself. This is significant, for after Strassmeyer showed up in Berlin once again after having suddenly disappeared in the USA, officials investigating the Oklahoma City bombing attempted to question him in 1997 and requested intelligence files and information from the German government. Germany, not surprisingly, replied that it had no police or intelligence files concerning Strassmeyer and absolutely no data on him whatsoever, an odd statement given the fact that Strassmeyer was a former officer in the German army, a graduate of its war academy, and more importantly, the son of Günther Strassmeyer, the head of the Christian Democrat Union Party in Berlin, Chancellor Kohl's chief of staff, a minister without portfolio, and one of the masterminds of the German reunification itself. The reunification revealed another sinister fact about post-reunification German and Eastern European politics, for despite the fact of decades of communist rule, neo-Nazi, neo-fascist and radically right-wing nationalist groups had secretly grown and festered throughout Eastern Europe, and nowhere more strongly than in the provinces of the former East Germany. For example, in elections held in April of 1998, Deutsche Volksunion, a scarcely disguised neo-Nazi political party, managed to win a stunning 13% of the vote in regional elections in Sachsen-Anhalt province. Another thinly disguised neo-Nazi party, the National Democratic Party, also won significant percentages in other local elections in the former Eastern Zone. These successes were attributed to the fact that these parties appealed to smouldering German resentment against the number of non-ethnic German foreign workers in the country, who, the parties alleged, were stealing jobs from native Germans. No one seemed to have noticed that the former Eastern Zone had less than 1% of its population composed of such foreign workers. With these election victories and Kohl's re-election bid pending at a national level, his government and Christian Democratic Union Party careened to the political right to such an extent that it became increasingly difficult to discern where political expediency ended and right-wing extremism began. Why had Kohl and the Christian Democratic Party lurched so far to the right? A dangerous move even after reunification, since the vast majority of Germans who lived in the former West Germany would never support such a government, at least, not openly. In order to appreciate the full significance of the neo-Nazi connections of Kohl's government, his party's rightward lurch, and the subsequent policies of his left-wing Social Democrat successor, Gerhard Schröder, it is necessary to examine the real tough in the United States almost unknown role that neo-Nazi groups actually played in orchestrating and driving the reunification. As open protests against communist regimes grew throughout Eastern Europe, first in Poland with Lech Wałęsa's Solidarity movement, and then other Eastern European nations, similar protests naturally began in East Germany, the most notoriously communist and pro-Soviet government in the former Warsaw Pact. Initially, these protests were led by East German intellectuals who, far from desiring a collapse of the East German state and reunification with the much more powerful West German government in Bonn, merely wished to introduce reforms that would introduce a mix of socialism and capitalism, the Nazi-inspired Third Way, once again, to the East German state. But as the protests spread throughout East Germany and finally reached Berlin, with West Berliners and East Berliners climbing the wall and beginning to tear it down, something else had happened. The covert neo-Nazi groups in the Eastern Zone came out in force and propelled the release of populist energy in a new direction, reunification. It did not take long before the uglier side of German nationalism began to assert itself. In Leipzig and other East German cities, skinhead youth hoisting flags of the 1937 German Reich marched alongside of those demanding unification. Soon, proponents of unity, including neo-Nazi militants, started to clash openly with those who still cherished the possibility of an independent East German state. It does not take a Nazi rocket scientist to figure out the parallelism at work, for in a manner similar to the Nazi Party's original private army of brown shirts, which literally physically brutalized its political opponents into submission and silence, those opposing reunification were physically silenced and effectively closed out of any debate. A series of violent attacks against ethnic non-Germans throughout the newly reunified country broke out spontaneously, primarily in the former East Germany. Utilizing a neo-Nazi computer network called the Thule Network, an international electronic fascism consisting of a tapestry of bulletin boards, blog sites and so on, and cell phones, neo-Nazi groups published information on political rallies, how to publish newsletters, and gave practical advice on the use of paramilitary political violence. One of the most significant of these violent attacks against non-German ethnic groups was the Rostock incident. German law enforcement officials turned a blind eye to the neo-Nazi-inspired violence in Rostock. The police had an arrangement not to intervene. One may perceive it for what it really is. The exploitation on the European scene of the same ethnic and economic tensions the Nazi International exploited so successfully elsewhere in the post-war world. And that means that as late as the mid-1990s, Martin Bormann's Nazi International was alive, well, and able to mount a coordinated effort right in the heart of Europe, and to drive both sides of a crisis by carefully advocating an East German third position reform as the thesis, propelling the neo-Nazi cooperation of that movement by demands for reunification, yet another third position, and proposing a unilateral scheme for reunification from Kohl's expellee society-influenced government itself. Make no mistake, this is not some flaw in the German national character or some wayward gene in the Teutonic gene pool. This was the result of an evil, brutal, and genocidal ideology that once ruled and exploited the flaws, and that was still well organized, well-financed, and inherently predisposed to do so once again. Without the neo-Nazis, there would have been no reunification. No sooner was the fatherland one big happy Reich once again than Germany began to flex its economic and military muscle on the European stage. The precipitous implosion of the Soviet Union into 15 separate countries left a huge power vacuum on the continent, a vacuum that a reunified Germany, by virtue of its pivotal location and economic might, was poised to fill. No longer confined to the perimeter of the Atlantic system, Germany would once again become the arbiter of Central Europe, a geopolitical construct that lay dormant while the Federal Republic bode its time as a frontline state during the Cold War. German hegemony throughout the region, consciously pursued, appeared to be a fait accompli. Central Europe is going to have a strong German flavor again, said retired State Department officer Douglas H. Jones. Even if it's not intentional, Germany could lurch into a destabilizing role. In a certain sense, the Soviet implosion and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact created such a vacuum that Germany literally was sucked into a dominant role in Eastern Europe once again. But it was not as if the German government and German business were not ready for the eventuality. The high cost and reunification necessitated a penetration in depth rather than breadth on the smaller economies of Eastern Europe. Accordingly, Germany invested strategically rather than profusely in Eastern Europe, focusing on crucial areas such as energy supplies, transportation, telecommunications, and mass media. This soon translated into new political muscle on the world stage, and a bossier manner as Germany began to insist upon a United Nations Security Council seat, and that Germany be elevated to the status of an official language within the European community.
Breaking free of NATO.
These moves were almost simultaneously accompanied by similar German assertiveness regarding NATO and its own armed forces. Germany's Constitutional Court, in a crucial 1994 ruling, declared that the German armed forces could participate in military operations beyond NATO's jurisdiction, and the then German Defense Minister Volker Ruhr, in a Bundeswehr German army, white paper circulated within the upper echelons of the German defense and intelligence establishment that same year, stated that the German army would henceforth function as an instrument of foreign policy. Reunified Germany had served notice, quietly but very firmly, that the gloves were off once again, and that Washington and Moscow would no longer have virtual veto power over Germany's defense and diplomatic agendas. As the then German Foreign Minister Klaus Kinkel put it, the 1994 court decision and Bundeswehr white paper gave Germany freedom of action in foreign policy. The brake that was holding us back is gone. With all these statements and maneuvers happening quietly, while most major Western media outlets scarcely covered them, it should come as no surprise that newly reunified Germany quickly became the world's second-largest exporter of arms, second only to the United States. And after having absorbed the former East German army, Germany could afford to reduce its standing army to 350,000. which still made the well-equipped and competently led Bundeswehr the largest army in Europe, and one of the largest standing armies for a nation of its population in the world. But Germany's intentions did not stop there. NATO itself, which had been intended as a check on both Soviet and, at the time of its formation, potential German expansion, was now revealed for what it was, at least as far as Germany perceived it. Although NATO was supposed to contain Germany as well as Russia, it proved to be the vehicle through which German military power was restored. And now that the superpower face-off had ended, German leaders indicated that they were ready to develop new security structures outside of NATO, including a European military force composed initially of 35,000 French and German soldiers. France, as the world's third-largest thermonuclear power, now in second place, coupled with Germany, would be a powerful economic and military alliance in its own right. The proposal from the newly relocated German government in Berlin was, needless to say, the source of some consternation at green-topped conference tables in Washington, D.C. and Wall Street, where the continental outlook of both European powers might well indeed translate into such new security measures. But even greater concern was quietly expressed when German military think tank openly reasserted the German claims to sovereignty and Germany's nuclear weapons research program. Even the publisher of Germany's popular liberal magazine, Der Spiegel, the Mirror, openly declared that situations could be conceived that Germany would have to have its own nuclear deterrent in spite of existing treaties. Yet, with world attention focused on Iran's potential nuclear popgun, not a word has been said in the major Western media about the far larger nuclear and thermonuclear potential of Germany, which, like Japan, could arm itself to the teeth with such weapons in a very short time if the situation demanded. For in fact, Germany never stopped perfecting and developing the means of isotope enrichment that it had begun to develop in World War II, and indeed was one of the world's major exporters of such technologies along with Russia and France. If there is any doubt about Germany's role in the proliferation of nuclear weapons, consider only Bonn's role in the military build-up of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, a role that, despite the US media's description of the facts, far outstripped the Soviet Union's role, for it was Germany, not Russia, that gave to Saddam the beginnings of his nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons programs. With the full knowledge and cooperation of the federal government and its BND spy apparatus, dozens of German companies were instrumental in helping Saddam Hussein develop one of the world's most diversified unconventional warfare arsenals. Several of West Germany's biggest firms supplied equipment and expertise to set up entire plants for the production of nuclear, chemical, and biological weaponry. Other countries, including the United States, cashed in on the macabre bonanza that created Iraq's high-tech death machine during the 1980s, but Bonn's role far outstripped the international competition. In addition to constructing Saddam's underground bunker and extending the range of the Scud missiles to be able to hit Israel, German engineers concocted new delivery systems for poison gas and dispensed advice on the most efficient way to enrich uranium into weapons-grade fuel for a nuclear bomb. Bonn, in fact, from the period of the First Gulf War in 1991 up to the Second Anglo-American invasion in 2003, bluntly thumbed its nose at repeated American and United Nations trade embargoes on Iraq and continued to provide Iraq with missile parts, chemical agents, and state-of-the-art engineering equipment, and later it would be disclosed that the BND had trained Iraqi and Libyan secret police units. These abrupt policy and attitude changes in Bonn and Berlin after the reunification were quickly followed up by very real flexing of German military and diplomatic muscle in several independent moves that signaled Germany's new independence on the international geopolitical scene. These initiatives concentrated on revising Versailles, once again, by exploiting the growing nationalism within Versailles, created multi-ethnic nations such as Yugoslavia, a polyglot nation with significant minorities of Roman Catholic Croatians, Bosnian and Kosovan Muslims, and the majority Eastern Orthodox Serbs and Czechoslovakia, another polyglot nation stitched together from Bohemian Czechs to Slovenian Slovaks and Ruthenians. And more ominously, Germany quietly signalled that it was also prepared to begin the long-term recovery of its lost eastern provinces, areas of territory occupied by modern-day Poland and Russia. Indeed, if the newly reunified Germany was to dominate Central Europe and Eastern Europe once again, these two relatively powerful polyglot nations, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, created by Versailles precisely to encircle Germany, had to be broken apart. If this sounds familiar, it should. For Adolf Hitler did one and the same thing to both countries, breaking Czechoslovakia apart prior to absorbing it, and absorbing Yugoslavia before breaking it apart and recognizing a puppet Nazi-controlled regime in Croatia. All that was missing this time were the black uniforms and jackboots. This time, however, there was a change in tactics, as neo-Nazi groups, with funding from covert backing of the Bonn government, were deliberately creating a German minority in Poland by buying up formerly German property in the formerly eastern provinces of the Reich. They openly purchased former German lands from cash-strapped Poland and established radio stations, printed newsletters, posted bilingual street signs in Polish and German, and changed the names of villages, once a sufficient German presence was re-established, from their Polish names back to their German ones. Poland naturally protested these activities directly to Bonn. Bonn's response was to demand that Warsaw give special rights and privileges to ethnic Germans in Silesia and Pomerania, and that they be allowed to carry German passports and vote in German elections. Warsaw had little choice but to knuckle under and caved in to these demands. Similar machinations befell the Russian oblast or province of Kaliningrad, which was but the northern portion of the former German province of East Prussia. The German city of Königsberg had been renamed Kaliningrad by the Soviets, who openly annexed the province at the end of the war and tried their best to Russianize it, transforming the port city into a major Baltic naval base for the Soviet Navy. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, however, and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, the Kaliningrad Oblast hangs precariously isolated between the German-dominated Baltic states and Poland. This time, Bonn was not so subtle, for it openly offered government financial incentives to any Germans, including relatives of the original German inhabitants of the city, to settle in Kaliningrad. The city soon became a magnet for right-wing extremists, who moved to the city in droves, bringing a host of German corporate branch offices, including a newly opened branch of Deutsche Bank not far behind them. It is significant that the German government, which has on the books of its legal code laws against legitimizing Nazism or neo-Nazism, nonetheless opened its treasury to such groups who wished to move to Kaliningrad. The city has thus become a haven, almost a Vatican, for European-based neo-Nazi groups. If Czechoslovakia, Poland, and even Russia were faced with invasions of former German territories by German-wielding not tanks, dive bombers, and heavy artillery, but Deutschmarks, Yugoslavia was not so lucky. Yugoslavia soon succumbed to the rising tide of neo-fascist-inspired nationalism in the former communist governments of Eastern Europe, when a breakaway Croatian republic was proclaimed in the former capital of the Nazi puppet Croatian Ustashi regime's capital, Zagreb. The breakup of that country, which the rest of the European Union with the United States attempted to prevent, was aided, abetted, and finally realized by the actions of one nation, Germany, when that nation unilaterally recognized Croatia as an independent nation toward the end of 1991, scarcely 2 years after the reunification. Despite the fact that the administration of President George Herbert Walker Bush charged Germany with contributing to the swiftly deteriorating conditions and escalating civil war in Yugoslavia, Germany openly defied Washington's protests and a United Nations arms embargo to the newly recognized country, supplying Croatia with almost $320 million of military hardware, including MiG fighter jets, 49 surface-to-air missiles, and late-model tanks. Having created the Balkan crisis by its precipitous diplomatic unilateralism, Germany then cleverly hid behind the auspices of NATO as Croatia and other minority republics formed from the former Yugoslavia requested NATO assistance to fight the militarily superior Serbia, which was fighting, after all, for its own territory. Thus, under the official diplomatic protection of the NATO alliance, Luftwaffe Air Force, fighter bombers, and fighters flew patrols over Croatia and Bosnia, preventing the Serbian Air Force from even penetrating their airspace. When Croatia requested German military personnel on its territory to enforce a peace accord between Croatia and Serbia in 1995, Germany only too readily agreed, and thus, for the first time since World War II, the German military was deployed beyond the borders of Germany in significant numbers. It was General Klaus Naumann, the first military chief of reunified Germany, who in fact pressured Bonn to send his troops to Croatia and Bosnia to gain actual combat experience. It was an event that marked a new phase in a gradual, step-by-step process orchestrated by German leaders to expand their influence across the continent. Critics warned that the Bosnia assignment would open the door to future military intervention in other areas, a development that Germany had prepared for by creating a highly mobile, 50,000-strong strike force capable of rapid deployment in any part of the world. On June 18, 1994, General Naumann's Bundeswehr troops celebrated the final departure of British, French, American, and Russian troops from Berlin with a Prussian-style torchlight parade in front of Berlin's Brandenburg Gate. It was a celebration to which the British, Americans, and Russians were not invited by the German government, but this was, really, nothing new. When Hitler's favorite Luftwaffe Air Force, ACE, and a significant member of Bormann's post-war Nazi International, Hans-Ulrich Rudel, died in 1982, over 2,000 people attended his funeral, many of whom paid their respects by stretching out a single arm and in unison bellowing the banned pro-Nazi verses of Germany over everything. As they did so, 2 Luftwaffe fighter jets flew over the site, dipping their wings low in salute of the former ace. Hans-Ulrich Rudel acted as a corporate ambassador for the giant German electrical firm of Siemens in Argentina, where Rudel made his home for years after the war.
Nazi International, Part 5, by Berk Gumus, October 3rd, 2023.
The post-war Nazi determination to dominate space.
That there were former Nazis in NASA in some very prominent positions, like von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, Kurt Debus, everyone knows, but few people realize that they actually influenced NASA in a pro-Nazi direction. The Nazis not only exhibited a great degree of influence inside of NASA during the heyday of its formation, up to the allegedly Apollo moon landing, but indeed, the Nazis exercised the greatest influence inside the organization, eventually co-opting or making common cause with 2 other significant, hidden, and esoteric influences in the space agency. The Bell Project's power plant designer at the EA, EG Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft in Berlin, was NASA flight director Dr. Kurt Debus. This is the man who was responsible for NASA's UFO files. He also ended up on the board of directors as a chairman of OTRAG. OTRAG stands for Orbital Transport and Rockets, Incorporated. It was the first private space company in history of the late 70s and early 80s by German engineer Lutz Kaiser. His goal was allegedly to develop low-cost rockets for the West German government that would cost half as much as a comparable American launch vehicle. In his search for a location to launch his rockets, he found what he was looking for in Central Africa. In 1976, the dictator Mobutu Sese Seko leased an area of about 100,000 square kilometers in what was then Zaire for unrestricted use. This corresponds roughly to the size of the former German Democratic Republic. In principle, Kaiser was free to dispose of this area and had quasi-extraterritorial rights. He also secured the rights to mine the mineral resources. Among other things, the media wrote about the Kaiser Empire in Africa and Mobutu's dreams of an African Cape Kennedy. But this area also became known as the African Area 51. OTRAG was first exposed by the then Soviet Premier and General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev as being a kind of privately owned front for what was, in effect, a West German version of Area 51. In his charges, Mr. Gorbachev indicated that much more than cheap satellite launching capability was being researched. He also accused West Germany of being involved with technology transfers from U.S. corporations to Germany of cruise missile technology. And additionally, Mr. Gorbachev accused the West of conducting chemical and biological warfare research at the OTRAG facilities in Zaire. Thus, the outbreak of Ebola in that country is at least extremely suspicious.
Shaba North, the former rocket launch site in former Zaire, today's Democratic Republic of Congo and Nazi International Area 51?
NASA was never intended to be, at its innermost core and highest levels, a civilian agency, contrary to common public and media perception that NASA is an open, strictly civilian scientific institution, is the legal fact that the space agency quietly founded as a direct adjunct to the Department of Defense, tasked with specifically assisting the national security of the United States in the midst of a deepening Cold War, with its major geopolitical advisory, the Soviet Union. The ability of NASA to cloak or classify data is further compounded by the introduction of three parties of power within NASA that would have their own reasons and agendas for doing so. Over the course of years, researchers, Richard C. Hoagland and Mike Barra in their book Dark Mission, The Secret History of NASA, identified three groups, each with their own connections deep within the world of occult and esoteric traditions that each held significant positions of managerial power and influence within NASA: Masons, magicians, and Nazis. The Nazi aspect of NASA was, of course, self-evident and well-known in popular culture. But less well-known were the other two occult and esoteric-based groups, the Masons and magicians. 1. The magicians, represented by rocket engineer and solid fuel expert Jack Parsons, with his own direct and personal involvement with British magician Aleister Crowley, the Ordo Templi Orientis, and his Golden Dawn magician. Parsons was well known to have connections to other practicing occultists, such as L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, and to have practiced himself on numerous occasions black magic and sex magic ritual. The influence of Parsons and the magicians runs directly from Parsons to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and other NASA centers clustered around it or directly tied to it.
Aleister Crowley, Jack Parsons, and L. Ron Hubbard, left to right, layman of Ordo Templi Orientis.
Excerpt from Contact Report 614.
Since I have been involved with the machinations of this criminal organization since its inception, I can only confirm what you say. The whole of the Scientology sect's endeavor, however, is not based solely on the establishment of a totalitarian world social order, but on the fact that a secret striving for effective world domination is prescribed, which is to encompass absolute control over all governments and authorities, as well as armies, secret services, and the entire economy. And in order to achieve this sect regards no means as too small, too difficult, or severe. Consequently, even the worst capital crimes have to be considered.
2. The Masons, represented by famous NASA director during the formative Mercury-Gemini Apollo years, James Webb, and by various astronauts like Buzz Aldrin, who were all Masons. The Masonic influence was felt throughout NASA, not only in Webb's largely successful attempts to democratize NASA and raise public interest in harness of space science in public schools throughout the country, but also in the esoteric influence it wielded in the selection of mission names, mission patches, and logos, and throughout the astronaut corps. The Masonic influence is thus centered upon the central NASA bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., and, at that time, within the astronaut corps itself. In typical Masonic fashion, it was a dispersed influence, rather like the system of Masonic lodges.
Buzz Aldrin first, James Webb second. Masonic square and compass symbol.
Three, the Nazis, represented by German scientists such as von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, Kurt de Boos, and space medicine specialists such as Hubertus Stronghold, and so on. This influence was centered around von Braun and his team, first in the immediate post-war years in New Mexico, later in Alabama, and other installations with prominent Nazi presence.
Kurt de Boos first, Werner von Braun second, Swastika-Symbol.
Three of the most compelling bits of evidence they adduce for the quiet exercise of this hidden occult influence are in the forms of mission names and patch logos, and the pervasive use of names derived from classical Egyptian or Greek mythology on the one hand, and the ritual alignments model on the other. For instance, if one looks at the official patch for the Apollo program below, armed with preceding heads up regarding the bizarre NASA focus on all things Egyptian, it becomes elemental to match the A for Apollo as an actual stand-in for Asar, the Egyptian designation for Osiris. This successful decoding of the hidden Egyptian meaning of the Apollo patch is redundantly confirmed because Asar Osiris is none other than the familiar Greek constellation of Orion, which is, of course, the background stellar constellation in the patch itself. In case you think such ritual symbolism is some kind of temporary historical aberration, confined only to the Apollo program and the 1960s think again, when NASA selected in 2007 a patch design for its CEV spacecraft, which will eventually replace the shuttle and ultimately take American astronauts back to the moon, planned for the year May 2024, look what NASA curiously picked again.
Apollo and Orion, mission patches. Depicting the constellation, Orion in the Apollo patch, and the 3 stars of Orion's belt in the Orion patch.
In looking at the patch, it struck Hoagland just how incongruent it was with the stated goals and mythology of NASA's official Apollo program to the moon. The patch depicts the Earth and Moon, with a flight path tracing from Cape Canaveral to a landing spot on the moon. The lunar disk is overlaid with a mythological deity presumably Apollo, and there is a large A in the center of the patch. The design was built around a very curious feature, the constellation of Orion, with its 3 distinctive belt stars comprising the bar in A. The history of the official adoption of the names for NASA's step-by-step manned space program, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, that would culminate with manned landings on the moon, only serve to highlight the strangeness of the Apollo program logo. For the project names were deliberately adopted by Abe Silverstein from Greco-Roman mythology at a conference in July of 1960. Hoagland looked closer, and the names Mercury and Gemini quickly revealed their own strangeness. As far as the mythology goes, Mercury, the god's messenger, seems appropriate for the single-man capsule and its quick missions. Yet, the NASA symbol for Project Mercury is a representation of the element mercury, rather than the Greek god Mercury, and is similar to a stylized Egyptian ankh.
NASA symbol for the Mercury project first, Egyptian ankh symbol second.
Alchemists considered mercury the first matter from which all other metals were derived. So was this a dual alchemical meaning for the name Project Mercury? Gemini, which means the twins in Latin, could not only refer to the 2-man capsule, but also to the rendezvous and docking procedures which were perfected on Project Gemini, and which were crucial to the later Apollo missions to the moon. Gemini is also frequently referenced to the constellation that borders Orion and boasts the twin stars Castor and Pollux as its most prominent features. Other myths link Castor and Pollux with the morning and evening stars, the planet Venus. Certainly, there is an inherent duality with all of these associations that well fits the twins' designation of the NASA program. 2 astronauts, 2 vehicles rendezvousing in space, the twin stars Castor and Pollux. But it was the Apollo patch that remained anomalously strange. Why call NASA's earliest manned spaceflight programs Apollo, or for that matter, Mercury and Gemini at all? Why the classical mythological and astrological focus? And why call it Apollo at all when the very constellation depicted in the patch is Orion? Hoagland consulted a semi-official book on the Moon program, which included a short citation from World Book Encyclopedia describing the mythological associations of Orion. Orion, the mighty hunter, was the son of the Greco-Roman god of the sea, Poseidon Neptune. The goddess Artemis Diana fell in love with Orion, but her brother Apollo took exception to this and tricked Artemis Diana into killing Orion. And at this point in the semi-official history of the Moon program, the obvious question occurred. Even this description, full of line after line about Orion compared to a single mention of Apollo, shows how much more important Orion is to the patch than Apollo. So why call the program Apollo at all? And why name the program after a petulant god who tricks his sister into murdering her lover? Is this the image NASA wanted of its first space pioneers, rather than the mighty hunter Orion? Why not just call the project Orion? The deliberate mixing of an Egyptian reference in the Apollo program logo, however, is significant, for Orion is, of course, another reference to Osiris, who plays such a central role in the Egyptian death and resurrection myth, and in that myth, there was a direct connection to the moon. For those who do not know the basic outlines of this legend, Osiris was murdered again through a trick at the hands of his brother Set, symbolized by the constellation Taurus. Vengeance is taken upon Set Taurus by the Osiris-Izan, Horus, represented by the star Sirius, and in some cases associated with the moon, resurrects Osiris. The story, Hoagland and Bora comment, is laden with paleophysical meanings, for it is full of astronomical references, including hints via key-coded numbers in the narratives, that the Egyptians fully understood the concepts of precession, lunar cycles, and stellar motion. There are also strong hints that these beings were not mythical gods at all, but rather real flesh and blood beings from an advanced civilization that visited Earth in antediluvian times. Both Egypt and Sumer viewed themselves as a legacy, and a declined one at that, from something far more ancient and much more sophisticated. As those texts indicate, the gods indeed taught early mankind the arts and some of their advanced sciences of civilization. Such interpretations of these texts was common currency in the esoteric circles and secret societies hovering in the background of the Nazi Party. But that left the initial question even more starkly outlined. What is a mythological Egyptian stellar deity doing representing an official U.S. governmental exploration of the moon? And in a program known under the designation of a Greek sun god, Apollo. Why not, for example, declare Diana, the Greek goddess of the moon? The initial answer is quite simple. Apollo is actually Horus. If one examines in detail Greek mythological literature and its derivations from the earlier Egyptians. Horus, like Apollo, is the Egyptian god of the sun, and also, curiously, ruled over Mars. Thus, it turns out that the $20 billion NASA Apollo exploration program of the moon was, in fact, nothing less than a disguised Osiris-Horus lunar landing program, straight out of ancient Egypt. At this point, it should be clear that the Nazi International are nothing but a continuation of the Giza intelligences and were cleverly hiding behind NASA. But there is also strong evidence that suggests that the Nazi International Giza intelligences were collaborating and working with the descendants of so-called Earth foreigners, which I suggested in the articles The Earth Foreigners and the Minoan Religion, and the Dogon Earth foreigner connection could be the descendants of Minoan, Sumerian, Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, and Mesoamerican. Gods especially worth mentioning in the context of this article, Horus, Osiris, and Isis.
The Nazi Earth Foreigner Connection.
As mentioned in Nazi International Part 3, the assassination attempt of Pope John Paul II by Mehmet Ali Agca was carried out by the Nazi-sponsored secret Turkish society called the Grey Wolves on the 64th anniversary of the first Marian apparition at Fatima. This can hardly be a coincidence. And when one thinks of the Marian apparition of Fatima, one automatically thinks of the Earth foreigners.
Excerpt from Contact Report 710.
Then I want to end this subject and hear from you what you have to say about the matter of the Giza intelligences, who were in reality the Earth foreigners, of whom there has been talk since time immemorial. So I have another question about Fatima, because at that time, on the 12th or 13th of October 1917, tens of thousands of onlookers in central Portugal were able to observe and witness a furious solar phenomenon. As early as the mid-1950s, Asket told me that the whole thing had been arranged by the Earth foreigners, whereby Asket also took me back in time to the exact moment when the event took place, which gave me the opportunity to observe the spectacle for myself and to realize that the alleged solar phenomenon had been conjured up for the whole crowd of onlookers by an Earth foreigner's flying objects.
So, why would the post-war Nazi International Giza intelligences choose the 64th anniversary of the first Marian apparition for the assassination of Pope Paul II? Could it be that the today's descendants of the Earth foreigners, Usher, hiding behind the esoteric and occult Masonic Lodge of NASA to maintain and expand their influence and control over the world as gods once like their ancestors did? Because after all, whoever gains control over space automatically has control over the world. There is also numerological evidence for the collaboration between the Nazi International, Giza intelligences, and a certain part of the Earth foreigners. Note, numerology influences NASA planning at a very deep level. The assassination attempt of Pope Paul II by the Nazi International sponsored Mehmet Ali Agca was carried out on May 13, 1981. The first Marian apparition in Portugal, at Fatima, happened also on May 13, 1917. In total, there were 6 Marian apparitions at Fatima, and all of them happened on the 13th day.
Wikipedia information.
After this preparation, the 3 shepherd children saw on May 13, 1917, a lady dressed all in white above a holm oak. Lucia conducted the dialogue with the lady. The children were asked to come to the same place for 6 months, each time on the 13th.
Note to what was said. The children were asked to return always on the 13th.
The 3 Shepherd Children of Fatima, 1917.
The second apparition of the lady happened on June 13, 1917. The third apparition on July 13, 1917. The fourth apparition on August 19, 1917. The date of the fourth apparition does not coincide with the number 13 only because the authorities kidnapped the children, pretending that they had to come to the priest to put an end to the coming riot. The children, therefore, spent August 13 in prison and missed the announced date. Then, after their release, when the children were again tending the sheep, the lady therefore appeared to them on August 19th. The fifth apparition, September 13, 1917, the sixth and most famous apparition where the actual miracle of the sun took place, as already mentioned, on October 13, 1917.
The crowd at Cova da Iria looking towards the sun on 13th October 1917.
The logical question now would be, why the so-called Lady of Fatima asked the children for 6 months to appear always on the 13th in the same place? The agenda of the earth foreigners for all these Marian apparitions is obvious: to maintain and expand their power and position as gods on earth, as their ancestors once did. And the best chances to fulfill their goals for power and domination were, they always had to perform the above-mentioned events on a 13th, as a kind of ritual adjustment to reinforce their desired intentions in relation to numerology, respectively Kabbalism. Because in old occult traditions it is said, who knows the meaning of the number 13, possesses the key to power and domination.
Excerpt from Contact Report 127.
But now, I am also well aware that many Earth twits have likewise dealt with Kabbalism for many centuries and millennia and have compiled a great deal about this calculation technique. But in old times, the true numerical values were lost in part through destruction by fire or other loss. Years ago, however, I found a book by an old count who called himself Chero and who wrote the Book of Numbers.
Excerpt from the book, Numerology, The Mystery of Numbers, book by Chero, page 98 to 103.
It is well known that most people have a peculiar seemingly ingrained awe of the number 13. However, this so dreaded number is not really an unlucky number for those who are aware of its significance. Probably the fear of this number has its cause in the fact that it was very often used in connection with occult matters, and occultism is, as is well known, a field which, according to its nature, was or is not familiar to most people. The number 13 was considered in any case, berets in old times, as an enormous, meaningful cause, an effect dominating or indicating number. In ancient occult lore it is said, he who knows the meaning of the number 13 possesses the key to power and domination.
But a gloomy meaning of the number 13 is not excluded. Even nowadays, it often happens that there is no room with the number 13 in a hotel. By the way, in the Italian theaters, there are no seats with the number 13, but the shyness of this number is limited only to some areas of the world. Elsewhere, it is highly revered or appreciated. In the Indian pantheon, there are 13 statues of Buddha. Most Indian and Chinese pagodas are surrounded by 13 disc-shaped decorations. In the shrine of the temple of Atsusa in Japan is kept a sacred sword, the pommel of which is formed of 13 representations of the mystery story. If we go further west on the globe, we learn that 13 was the sacred number of the Mexicans. They also knew 13 snake slayers in their lore. Finally, we should mention the positive role that the mysterious number 13 even plays in North American tradition. The United States of America were originally formed by 13 member states whose Latin motto, E pluribus unum, out of many the one, is made up of 13 letters. The two wings of the North American heraldic or state eagle consist of 13 feathers each. And when George Washington raised the Republican standard for the first time, he was greeted with 13 gun salutes.
Conclusion.
Pope Paul II survived the assassination attempt and attributed this happening immediately as a miracle and rescue of the grandmother Maria, and thanked her also with a pilgrimage to Fatima, which again maybe was pre-calculated by the descendants of the earth foreigners for the attainment of more power and rule by manipulation of religion, in this case, of Christianity. Because after all, don't you think if the Nazi International Geisha Intelligence's earth foreigners wanted the Pope dead, he would surely be dead too? In 2019, approximately 6.3 million pilgrims came to Fatima, more than to any other pilgrimage site in Europe. Many of them came in one of the 4,284 groups of pilgrims who registered with the pilgrimage office. 2,854 of them came from abroad from more than 80 countries, and 1,530 from Portugal. Opposite the old Basilica of the Rosary, the new Basilica of the Most Holy Trinity was consecrated in 2007. With almost 9,000 seats, it is the fourth largest Catholic church in the world. Between the two churches is also the largest church forecourt in the world. However, it must be said that there is strong evidence that since ancient times the so-called earth foreigners are internally divided into two separate groups or elites with two different paths and two different goals, which I will explain thoroughly in a 3-part article series called Earth Foreigners Revealed. The two ancient elites that rule the world. But why associate the Egyptian god of rebirth and resurrection, Osiris, via his son Horus Apollo, to this program at all? It was only after Hoagland noted the name of another space vehicle, the shuttle Atlantis, that he began to put the pieces together. What if this wasn't the first time man had reached across space to touch the moon? What if the ancient Egyptian Zep Tepi, literally the first time, era of Osiris, Isis, Horus, was not a myth, but a reality? Hoagland began to search the record for other Egyptian connections in the names associated with the Apollo program. And he found them. The lunar module of Apollo 15 was named Falcon, and Falcon of the Horizon was, of course, one of the titles of Horus. Additionally, the Apollo 16 lunar excursion module had been openly named Orion. The Apollo command module Columbia drew its name from Saint Columba, a 6th century monk who, in Masonic lore, brought a sacred stone to Scotland from Egypt. But program logos and Egyptian connections were not all that Hoagland discovered. Perhaps the most significant indicator, if not surely one of the most controversial, was his discovery that NASA's moon landings appeared to have been deliberately coordinated with astrological significances in mind. The key mission that tipped him off, as far as the moon program was concerned, was Apollo 10. Here is it necessary to cite dark mission at length, with all of the primary technical and mission planning components having been tested and proven out. The next mission was a full-up dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. Launched May 18, 1969, Apollo 10 acted as a pathfinder for Apollo 11's Eagle, following the same descent path that Apollo 11 would 2 months later. Eventually, Thomas P. Stafford piloted Snoopy to within 8.4 miles of the lunar surface, about 44,000 feet, prompting lunar module pilot Gene Cernan to comment ominously, "Man, we's getting down among them." Given that their altitude was nearly 50,000 feet above the lunar surface, we can't help but wonder what Cernan was talking about. At that altitude, lunar surface features, even mountains, would be obscure and far away. However, given where Stafford and Cernan were at that moment, passing through Sinus Meaty and heading on toward Mare Smithy, the only thing they could have been down among at 50,000 feet would be Hoagland's theorized miles-high glass domes. Undeniably, the location and the altitude would be correct for that to be what Cernan was talking about. This bizarre comment also raises the other strangely incongruous aspect of Apollo 10. While the spacecraft was theoretically fully capable of landing on the moon, inexplicably it was not given the capability to do so. Not only was the mission denied the fuel to make a safe lunar landing, the tanks on board were literally only half filled. But the lunar module, Snoopy, was a crippled version of the real vehicle, unable to physically land on the lunar surface. Politically, this makes no sense. Still in a fierce race with the Soviet Union to be the first to land a man on the moon, Apollo 10 had everything necessary to accomplish this long sought-after political goal. Except the tools to do so. The Saturn V, the lunar module, and the command service module had all been tested on previous missions, and the NASA Long-Distance Lunar Communications Network was tested on Apollo 8. There was no practical canonical reason not to land Apollo 10. With only 2 more shots at making the goal Kennedy's end of the decade, the question is, why wait? As he delved ever deeper into the arcane, Egyptian mysteries surrounding these supposedly secular, scientific, and engineering NASA missions, Hoagland finally found his answer. Because it wasn't time yet. In other words, the only way to explain why Apollo 10 had not been given the mission assignment to make a lunar landing was quite simply that it did not fulfill some hidden requirement of the esoteric Egyptian agendas apparently driving or influencing NASA planning at a very deep level. Testing this hypothesis, Hoagland began to enter data into computer programs designed to show astronomical alignments. The results stunned him, for at the exact moment that Buzz Aldrin celebrated his allegedly now-famous communion ceremony on the moon, Sirius, stellar symbol of Isis, resurrector and consort of Osiris, was at 19.5 degrees elevation from the horizon. And 19.5 was one of the key numbers encoding a hyperdimensional tetrahedral physics. Furthermore, this implied that well before the alleged Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969, there were individuals within NASA who were fully informed about aspects of its hyperdimensional physics. To give the esoteric and numerological connections even more weight, Aldrin's alleged communion ceremony took place exactly 33 minutes after the Eagle had landed. And Aldrin was one of the astronauts who was a Mason. The odds against all this being coincidental are, of course, quite high. Further investigation yielded similar Egyptian astronomical correlations for Apollo 12.
Excerpt from Contact Report 203.
As we have already explained several times, the Americans' Apollo 11 moon landing on the 20th of July, 1969, did not take place because everything was a great designed swindle through which the entire world was fooled.
Note: only because the Apollo 11 moon landing was staged, it does not mean that the above-mentioned numerological values during the staging of the moon landing do not fulfill a specific purpose. These alignments implied something else, and something extraordinarily significant. Consider only the complex degree of planning and coordination that has to occur in order for such a mission to be pre-planned. Going to the moon or any other planet with current propulsion technology requires a tremendous amount of careful and prior mission planning. Because fuel and rocket thrust are very limited, leaving for a specific planetary designation with a precisely timed pre-planned arrival time and specific landing site in mind requires an immense amount of detailed knowledge of key celestial mechanics. This encompasses all relative planetary and spacecraft motions, ranging from precise planetary orbits to planned spacecraft departure and arrival times, to the individual planetary rotation rates themselves. The latter critically impact mission departure and arrival times, if not the intended landing site geometry itself. Bluntly put,
these considerations meant nothing less than that the astronomical astrological alignments exhibited by these landings must have had the highest mission planning priority
over all other publicly stated goals of the Apollo landing program. They would have to be given top priority over all other objectives, be they political, general mission science, specific lunar geological sampling, and even crew safety. Even the man who trained the astronauts and who ultimately selected them had his own Egyptian connections. In fact, he, Farouk El-Baz, was Egyptian. Moreover, his father was an expert in Egyptian religion, and particularly its astronomical symbolisms.
El-Baz first, training Ronald Evans and Robert Overmyer.
There were even ritual alignments operative when President Kennedy made his famous speech before Congress, setting the goal of reaching the moon before the decade was out. For as it turned out, those alignments, coupled with Apollo 12 and Surveyor 3's landing site, fixed an entire lunar ritual network. All three groups' magicians, Masons and Nazis, could claim a justifiable interest in esoteric matters as a part of their pedigree, and thus, Hoagland and Barra concluded that, at a very early period, even before the founding of NASA itself, these three groups made common cause and literally stole the entire space program for themselves from the rest of all mankind.
The biggest ritual alignment of them all.
Noting that two of the crucial landings, Surveyor 3 and Apollo 16, the first of which had indeed helped fix the entire lunar landing ritual grid, actually occurred on April 20th, 1967 and 1972. April 20th was Adolf Hitler's birthday. Again, put this in the context of the detailed and complex planning required to land a particular spacecraft on a particular day and time on another planet, and at a particular place. Such landings could not be accidental. Moreover, the Apollo 16 lunar excursion module was named Orion, which, when combined with the obvious symbolism of a landing on Hitler's birthday, strongly suggested a potential resurrection, specifically on his birthday, of something in the name of Hitler. Given the esoteric ideology of Nazism itself, an ideology that, in Heinrich Himmler's Ancestral Research Bureau, sought to trace German ancestry back to the Aryan race they believed to have colonized Sumer and Egypt, the conclusion for Hoagland and Barra was inescapable, and it is best to allow them to tell it in their own words. This new ritual coincidence, a second NASA mission deliberately landed on the day of Hitler's birth, finally brought the astonishing set of alignments into crystal clear, sharp focus. For, by these repeated ritual coincidences, commemorating the infamous leader of the Third Reich, the key players behind this entire NASA lunar ritual were now overwhelmingly identified as none other than the NASA members of the former Reich. NASA, at the highest levels, had effectively been taken over from the Masons by von Braun. Authors note, in my opinion, it was not so much a takeover, but more a collaboration between these two groups. Nazis' Giza intelligences, Masons' Earth foreigners, that has existed for thousands of years, which I will explain in upcoming articles, and that leads us in turn to another grouping at NASA, to the so-called magicians, and the possibility that certain extraterrestrials may have also been or still are behind this grouping as well.
NASA's magicians and the long-skulled gods of Egypt.
As mentioned above, the magicians at NASA were represented by rocket engineer and solid fuel expert Jack Parsons and British occultist Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley is said to have contacted a being from another dimension called Lamb.
Excerpt from Contact Report, 826.
So also, for example, with regard to extraterrestrials who really came here, such as the long skull ones who came from outer space, and authors note, another dimension? To Earth, Svath said, but which I should not say and keep silent about.
This sketch by Crowley is supposedly drawn from life, and it was displayed publicly in 1919 before the so-called gray aliens became known and popular in modern culture.
This being called lamb bears also resemblance to the long-skulled gods, or extraterrestrials, that once ruled over Egypt. See Contact Report 710.
4 examples of elongated skulls found at the archaeological site in Paracas, Peru. The DNA fragments studied indicate that they are a different human-type creature, far removed from Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. The cranial volume is up to 25% larger and 60% heavier than conventional human skulls, and only 1 parietal plate instead of 2, meaning the head could not have been intentionally deformed by flattening. Possible depiction of the long-skulled gods of Egypt.
This quote from Aleister Crowley may provide further evidence for this thesis. The way. Lam is the Tibetan word for way or path, and Lama is he who goeth, the specific title of the gods of Egypt, the treader of the path, in Buddhistic phraseology. Its numerical value is 71, the number of this book. Parsons, as also mentioned before, was well known to have connections to other practicing occultists, such as L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. And that leads us to Xenu, Scientology's galactic overlord, and the similarities in appearance to the being called Lam and the long-skulled gods of Egypt mentioned above.
The story of Xenu, created by L. Ron Hubbard, is part of the belief of Scientologists in extraterrestrial civilizations, an intervention of alien beings in the events on Earth.
Interesting to know.
It is now widely known that the assassination of President Kennedy was masterminded by a group of interests consisting of the CIA, the FBI, the Mafia, a pro-Cuban group, oil barons, and the military-industrial complex. But most people don't realize that above all of these groups was Martin Bormann's Nazi International, the real mastermind of the whole operation. The Gehlen organization may not only have taken a hand in the actual training of Lee Harvey Oswald for his defection to the Soviet Union after all. Who else had the experience of operations behind the Iron Curtain to the extent that Gehlen's organization did? See Nazi International Part 4. But there is also the matter of Kennedy's threatening to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces. This, coupled with his offer to go to the moon jointly with the Soviet Union, took direct aim at 2 of the bureaucracies and the suns into which Nazis had infiltrated, NASA and the CIA. Moreover, such cooperation would have directly threatened the putative Nazi International with exposure. And consider the other fingers, pointing to Martin Bormann and his Nazi International. Hoagland and Barra have strongly stated that the hidden agenda of the Apollo missions by the Nazis was the recovery of alien technology from the moon. Further, they claim that it was clear from the ritual timing of Kennedy's critical address to that joint congressional session, May 25, 1961, that the Nazis had carefully set up the president on what the real objectives of Apollo would become, including the in situ reconnaissance and return to Earth of artifacts from the ancient ruins that the Nazis somehow knew about and clearly viewed as being left by their own ancestors. If this is true, no wonder Kennedy was murdered, immediately after his repeated offer to share this priceless Nazi heritage with their worst enemies, the Russians. And there is Alan Welsh Dulles himself, a member of the Wall Street elite that helped establish the technology transfers between the United States and Germany, and the very elite that also helped to establish the enormous monster of the German cartel system between World War I and II. Dulles, of course, became a director of the CIA, remained friends with Galen, and was fired by Kennedy for his part in the disastrously unsuccessful Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Yet, even with these conflicts of interest, Lyndon Johnson appointed him as a member of the Warren Commission investigating Kennedy's death. And present with him as a member of that commission was John J. McCloy, former Allied High Commissioner for occupied Germany and a former lawyer for I.G. Farben's interests in America. Small wonder, then, that neither District Attorney Jim Garrison nor Oliver Stone in his celebrated movie, JFK, really knew how to deal with the Nazi connection. And more importantly, it also indicates that the two-track space program, the one with rockets for public consumption, represented by Apollo, with its own hidden archaeological agenda, and the secret one with exotic physics and alternative technologies, represented by the Bell etc., Dr. Richter C., Nazi International Part 2, and the presence of the Bell Project's power plant designer, NASA flight director, Dr. Kurt Debus, was alive and well.